We arrive where we began, with a question that now feels like a home. What if the moon is our longest conversation with time? Its dust holds echoes. Its light invites gentleness. Its pull shapes our days. Will we learn to listen long enough to hear the ending, or to realize there isn't one? We close our eyes to see better, and the night nods back. What if the moon remembers us not as heroes or inventors, but as a warmth along the edge of water, as a brief shimmer on basalt, as an exhale that leaned the tides a little farther up the shore, not because we are central to its story, but because memory is not a ledger. It is a field where traces settle, tiny and patient and indifferent, and in that calm indifference there is a kind of mercy, a place where erosion becomes a soft eraser, and entropy becomes a slow librarian, filing everything under silence. We think of isotope trails like pale signatures hidden in rock, oxygen ratios that whisper of shared origins, argon that clocks the cooling of lava seas, noble gases tucked inside, glass beads like ancient breath. And we wonder if these numbers are the moon's way of speaking without a voice, if fossils on Earth and impact melt on the moon are two halves of a single sentence written across deep time, one half crowded by oceans and subduction, and the hungry churn of weather, the other left in vacuum, unbitten by rain, where even a footprint lingers like a thought that will not leave. We remember that continents sink themselves quietly back into the mantle, that seabeds dive along trenches and are remade as mountains, that our atmosphere has worn many faces, thicker, thinner, richer, leaner, and in every change a library has burned and been rebuilt, while the moon has watched, unblinking, its regolith turning over grain by grain under micrometeorite snow, not fast, not slow, but steady. And perhaps this is why we feel gentler in moonlight, why time seems to widen and breathe, because perception loosens its grip when sharpness fades, because we can hear the smaller clocks, a cooling crystal, a settling slope, a distant tremor that maps a hidden void. Could it be that identity, ours and Earth's, is braided with this companion's pull, tides mixing the ocean, currents carrying heat to edges of life, cycles setting the rhythm of reefs and migrations? And if day lengthened differently, if the moon drifted a little more or less, would we be the same listeners, the same tellers of stories? Maybe, maybe not. We hold in our hands a bead of lunar glass, and imagine the sun's temper etched inside. We hold in our hands a fossil shell, and imagine an ocean long vanished into the crust. We hold in our hands a quiet that feels like being seen without being judged, and the thought returns. What if memory is not only what stays, but also what goes and leaves an outline behind? Not because forgetting is failure, but because forgetting makes room for the next layer of light, the next soft imprint, the next uncertain step. And so we listen, and so we drift, and so we ask, if this much can be kept without a voice, what else might be kept without our knowing? And if this much can be lost, what else might we have forgotten? We pause at the edge of that forgetting, and the quiet opens like a tide pool at night, slow and reflective, where even the smallest ripple has a memory, not because water clings to shape, but because gravity teaches it to return. Again and again, we follow that motion back to stone, to plates that drift and meet, to trenches where old seafloors bow and vanish into heat, and we feel how oceans write themselves into mountains by going under, how fossils slip from air and light into pressure and time, how an ammonite spiral becomes a whisper in limestone, and then a silence, and then a lesson that only patient hands can read. What if this is how the planet keeps its diary, on pages that are constantly taken and rewritten, each sentence in chalk, each paragraph rinsed by rain and the grinding of sand? We think of isotopes, of carbon counting lost forests, of oxygen remembering temperatures we never felt, of strontium mapping rivers that no longer exist, and we wonder if the body of Earth carries a bloodstream of numbers, quiet and precise, flowing beneath our stories. Could it be that what disappears is not gone, only rearranged into another kind of presence? dust to sediment, shell to crystal, ash to fertile slope. Entropy not as theft, but as a slow librarian who reshelves the same meanings until we learn to find them by touch. We picture continents like rafts, dark and patient, drifting over a mantle that breathes in millions of years, and we hear faintly the scrape of their undersides, the pulse of mid-ocean ridges adding new floor, the deep crackle of cooling basalt as it takes in water and becomes something else, becomes memory in mineral, becomes the kind of history that does not need ink. And if time is wider than we imagine, if epochs fold like blankets, then maybe our sense of self is only a brief shape in the dust, important because it is honest, not because it is permanent. Maybe identity is a shoreline, shifting with each tide, recognizable and yet never the same. And the fossils we keep on shelves are not trophies of certainty, but invitations to listen longer to a chorus that began before language. Is it possible that atmospheric change, the slow exhale of volcanoes, the green breath of forests, the bright intervention of ice and thaw, has tuned the planet the way a musician tunes a string, tightening and loosening, until a tone emerges that life can hold, not because the world favors us, but because the world experiments with every variable it can reach. And so we sit with a trilobite's eye in our palm, and a meteor shard in the other, and we realize the two are cousins in time, both shaped by impact, both sculpted by patience, one carved by water and burial, the other by fire and flight, and we wonder which one is closer to the truth, or if truth is the gentle overlap, where both are needed. What if the greatest losses, archives burned in the crust, beaches erased by storms, cities softened back into soil, are not endings, but the slow training of our attention toward what persists beneath names, not because names are useless, but because names are only the surface calm, and we are learning to hear the current that moves below. Maybe the earth keeps loving us the way the tide keeps loving the shore, not by staying, but by returning again and again, changing us in ways we barely notice, smoothing sharpness, leaving tiny gifts in the rack line of memory. And yet, if subduction can swallow continents and still offer back a mountain, if isotopes can trace rain that fell before birds sang, if fossils can cross from creature to stone without losing their shape, then what else might be carried across the long night of forgetting, and what else might rise, soft and strange, when the darkness lifts just a little? We linger with that soft and strange rise, letting our eyes adjust to slower clocks, not because we expect revelation, but because patience is a kind of seeing. The planet has practiced this for billions of years, letting continents drift like sleepwalkers across a warm mantle, letting trenches open their quiet mouths and take in the old seafloors, letting basalt cool with tiny breaths of ocean folded into crystal, and in those crystals, isotopes keep their calm arithmetic, oxygen ratios hinting at pale temperatures, neodymium and strontium sketching the ancestry of rocks, carbon tracing forests that exhaled into skies now gone. And we begin to hear how chemistry stores seasons the way tree rings, store winters, how fossils keep time by turning bone to mineral, and mineral to message, and message to memory. What if entropy is not a thief but a gardener, pulling down the tall and feeding the small, letting decay return shapes to the common pool, not because endings are cruel, but because beginnings need room? Could it be that whole climates have come and gone, atmospheres fattened and thinned, ice sheets learned to walk and then to sleep, while identity, ours Earth's, remained a moving shoreline, erased and redrawn with every tide of heat and cold? We watch the subtle eraser at work, rain loosening cliffs into talus, glaciers grinding bedrock into flour, dunes migrating grain by grain, until the map learns a new word for place, and we remember that even mountains are temporary and even silence is busy, filled with slow rearrangements that tomorrow will call history. Is it possible that much of what we call forgetting is only a translation we haven't learned yet, a fossil grammar waiting under fields, a layer of ash that still holds the shape of a vanished forest's breath? Maybe, maybe not. We hold that uncertainty like a warm stone, and as night deepens we notice how memory prefers edges, the edge of a coastline, the edge of a fault, the edge where one mineral becomes another, and we lean toward those thresholds, listening for the small clicks of time as minerals exchange, as gases dissolve, as shells surrender to calcite and calcite to chalk, and chalk to a white cliff that remembers plankton more faithfully than any book. Not because cliffs speak, but because persistence does, and just as we begin to trust this language of slow change, we wonder what if traces of us also enter this quiet, not as monuments but as thin layers and altered atoms, as soot in ice and metals in silt, as a narrow band that future hands will read by touch. And yet if the world can store so much in stillness, if oceans can swallow and return, if stones can carry winters across millions of summers, then what else might be hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right angle of light to rise and reveal itself? We wait for that right angle the way dawn slides along a cliff, and suddenly every fossil rises in relief, not because the stone has changed, but because light has learned how to speak in that soft reveal. We notice how time leaves signatures we can follow like faint trails across a field. Oxygen in shells remembering the chill of ancient seas, carbon in charcoal holding the breath of vanished forests, strontium carried by rivers into bones that became stone, each ratio a whisper, each whisper a doorway into an epoch we did not live, but can still feel. What if forgotten ages are not gone, but folded, pressed like leaves in a book of pressure and heat, where subduction tucks a page beneath the next, and at the margins, volcanoes lift the corner just enough for memory to breathe. We picture ocean plates dark and heavy, bending into trenches, sinking into warm depths where basalt becomes metamorphic music, where water leaves and returns, where minerals rearrange their small cities of atoms and write a new script in the same alphabet. Could it be that decay is not defeat but design, a way to loosen what is too tight, a way to spread meaning into many places at once? Pone to calcite, calcite to chalk, chalk to cliff, cliff to dust that spills back into sea, where tiny lives will borrow the calcium again and scribble with it. Maybe, maybe not. We listen for the hush between certainties, that gentle space where a glacier's retreat reveals striations like notes on a staff, where wind combs dunes into ripples that look like the memory of waves, where a petrified forest keeps its rings, even after the wood has learned to be quartz. Is it possible that our perception is the real erosion smoothing edges, so the world can slip into us without scraping, so we can carry more than we think without noticing the weight? We follow entropy's slow kindness across a landscape, rust softening iron back toward earth, lichens tasting granite, sulfates blooming in dry caves like frost that does not melt, and we notice how each small surrender builds a larger order that no single piece intended, not because the world plans but because the world practices, and when atmospheric change leans the climate toward another key. VO2 rising and falling like breath over ice ages, currents shift, rain lines sway, deserts pulse, and life edits itself with a patience we seldom trust, replacing chapters but keeping the theme. What if identity works the same way, a coastline of self drawn new each day by tides we cannot command, yet recognizable enough that we call it by name? In the quiet we hold a trilobite's eye to the light, and see the compound patience of a creature that learned to divide vision into many small truths, and we wonder if that is what science does when it counts isotopes and measures layers, not to hold the whole, but to gather enough fragments that the silhouette appears. And yet if a hill can be a library and a core of ice can be a diary and a single grain of zircon can outlast continents, then what other pages are we still walking over without reading? And what other stories might rise, slow and silver, when the light finally learns where to fall? And if other stories might rise when the light learns where to fall, then maybe origin itself is a moving light, glancing off different faces of the same stone, until one angle finally reveals the grain, We lean into that idea as gently as a tide, not to force a revelation, but to see how beginnings linger in debris, how a planet can be born more than once in the arithmetic of collisions and cooling, not because elegance demands a single clean event, but because deep time has room for drafts. What if the moon's chemistry, those oxygen and titanium balances, those tungsten hints and chromium shades, are the margins where the cosmos wrote its edits, crossing out some versions, circling others, leaving notes we now read as isotope trails? We picture a young Earth breathing steam and lightning into a sky that did not yet know blue, a mantle lit by heat we can only imagine, while a newborn satellite cooled in layers, not all at once but with pauses, like a thought. Could it be that our sense of a single birth is a kindness to our limited patience, and that in truth origin is a geologic chorus, debris regathered, energy spent and stored, magma oceans settling into crust, as if a bowl of light were learning to become stone? Maybe, maybe not. We hold that doubt like a smooth pebble, turning it in the palm as we consider how entropy did not simply scatter but arranged, how decay measured the tempo, hafnium becoming tungsten, uranium stepping toward lead, so that time itself left bookmarks we cannot misplace. And in these bookmarks we glimpse a world still forming while already forgetting the heat that made it, a world cooling enough to keep a memory yet warm enough to reshape it, a memory both fragile and resilient, like glass quenched in sudden cold, that later devitrifies to a quiet cloud. Is it possible that the moon's steady face is a compromise between chaos and calm, a truce signed in basalt, where ancient seas of lava stilled into dark plains that make our nights gentle, even as the highlands keep the older scars bright? We imagine early atmospheres trading gases with fire and stone, hydrogen fleeing, carbon hiding, water arriving as vapor and impact and slow exhale from minerals, each cycle a revision to the script, each revision a softened echo of the last, not because the world knows where it is going, but because it knows how to continue. And so when we say origin, we might mean ongoing. When we say formed, we might also mean forming, in the way a coastline is never finished, and a glacier writes its letter by melting, in the way subduction returns a seafloor to the deep, so that another ridge can rise and breathe out new rock, and the circle does not close so much as widen. We listen for that widening in the hush between quake and echo, in the long patience of zircon that outlives continents, in the small kindness of clay that holds a pollen grain long after the forest has forgotten its own shade. What if our first chapters are not behind us but beneath us, still warm in places, still changing in places, still editing in places where pressure gathers thought and heat, persuades minerals to rearrange like careful minds, rewriting a meaning they will never finish? And yet, if beginnings can be plural and memory can be porous, if the moon can keep our nights steady while carrying unanswered numbers in its dust, then what else might the dark plains be hiding under their quiet, and what other messages might be waiting in the cold light to be read by a slower eye? And if other messages wait in the cold light for a slower eye, then perhaps tides are the first script we learn to read without letters, the gentle pull that writes itself on every shore, not because water chooses, but because the moon leans and earth answers. We feel that answer in the long rhythm of bays and estuaries, in the migration of silt, in the way mangroves and salt marshes breathe by the clock, and the clock is not on a wall but in the sky, and in the sea itself, where currents rearrange heat, like careful hands smoothing a blanket for sleep. What if time for the ocean is measured less by minutes and more by turning, by the slow stretch of days as the moon drifts outward a little each year, a few centimeters only, barely a whisper, yet enough to uncurl the length of daylight over ages, enough to change the way wind and waves share their work? We follow that work back through forgotten epochs, where tides may have been taller, where coastlines learned different shapes under a stronger grip, where tidal mixing brought deep nutrients to the surface with a little more insistence, and life, sensing a rich pulse, answered with blooms and shells that would one day become limestone and chalk, a record of rhythm written in calcium and quiet. Could it be that our own pulse settles when we watch the tide, because the body recognizes a kinship, not poetic but literal, salt calling to salt, the lunar tug threading through us as it threads through bays, a barely felt nudge that still arranges habits and myths, and the hours we choose to gather. Maybe, maybe not, yet we see how erosion moves to this metronome, cliffs softened by the patient lift and fall, beaches migrating like slow animals, deltas forming a handwriting that never decides on one signature, and all the while entropy does its unhurried kindness, moving energy from sharp difference toward gentler balance, not because peace is required, but because gradients ask to be softened, and the ocean listens. Is it possible that fossils on the continental shelf are tide-etched diaries, oyster beds stacked like pages, burrows frozen in place where the water once hurried and then rested, and that isotope trails in shells carry an echo of ancient moons, not their faces but their distances, their angles, their way of leaning into us more or less strongly across time? We think of atmospheric change, tugging in counterpoint, ear thickened or thinned by volcanoes and forests, by ice setting its pale hand on the planet, by currents that carry warmth north and south, and the moon's pull lays a quiet rhythm over all of it, not commanding, just steady, a heartbeat beneath the weather's complicated breath. And when plates dive at trenches pulling ocean floors into heat, they carry tide-made sediments down with them, clay and shell and salt, becoming part of the deep story, recycled into magma that may someday rise as a line of volcanoes, exhaling water and carbon back to the air, closing a loop so large we forget to call it a loop at all. What if this is how identity spreads through cycles that seem separate until the night is quiet enough for their chorus to fuse? And what if the slow lengthening of days is a subtle teacher, asking life to learn new timings, to molt, to migrate, to flower at shifts that most eyes never notice? We trace that patience in choral banding in tidal rhythmites, laid down like breathing in stone, and we wonder how many of our own stories are tuned by a clock we did not set, a clock that ticks in centimeters per year and whispers in coastlines rather than in hands and numbers, not because we are unimportant, but because we are included. And yet if the moon can stretch our hours and stir our seas, if a soft pull can sculpt continents' edges without a shout, then what else might a force so quiet be shaping in the dark? What other patterns might appear when we look not at the water, but at the shadows it leaves behind? And if patterns appear when we look at the shadows water leaves behind, then perhaps the quiet machines of our time, flags that do not flutter, ladders that do not rust, glass that learned its shape in a furnace, are themselves shadows etched into dust, not because they are loud, but because vacuum keeps a secret better than air. We imagine the moon as a slow museum where entropy works with silk gloves, where decay is mostly light and micro-impacts, where a footprint becomes a sentence and a cable becomes a line break, and we wonder what a distant future would read in this sparse typography, whether alloy compositions would tell of our patience or our haste, whether the isotopes in our metal, nickel, chromium, rare traces of hafnium would serve as timestamps the way tree rings do. Steady and unarguable, what if a single shard of tempered glass, sun-baked and dust-scoured, could hold the memory of a launch, the way a fossil holds the memory of a body, not in flesh but in form, not because glass thinks, but because shape is a language that outlasts storms? We picture solar wind padding the surface with ions, a soft rain that charges grains until they leap, a slow dance of electrostatic lifts and settles, and in that dance our artifacts are gently brushed, gently buried, gently revealed, like secrets that never needed to hide. Could it be that techno-fossils are not just objects, but patterns, regularities in an irregular place, right angles where geology prefers arcs, arrays where randomness wanted scatter, a bolt thread shining with an intent that basalt never had, and if so, does intent itself fossilize, not as morality, but as geometry? Maybe, maybe not. Still, we walk through this museum with our minds, moving past descent stages and reflectors, past pale blankets that once kept warmth in, and are now the color of long light, and we think about how Earth would have eaten these things: rain loosening glue, salt mist corroding edges, bacteria tasting the last sugars, but here the eater is time alone, and time is not hungry, only thorough. Is it possible that by leaving these quiet artifacts in a place without weather, we have made a mirror more faithful than any archive, a mirror that will show our shape long after our language forgets its own roots? We feel the gentle arithmetic of exposure, years adding up to charge and micropits, micrometeorites peppering the same panel until a film of glassy dust forms, and we hear the slow grammar of abrasion, not violence but persistence, not erasure but softening, the way a memory stays but loses its sharp corners, not because memory fails, but because memory learns to be kind, and somewhere under a thin drift of regolith, a circuit rests, its solder dull but intact, its pathways still true to their tiny cities of tin and lead, and we ask whether meaning remains when current is gone, whether the design of a thing is its spirit or only its outline. What if these shapes will one day be found by new hands, ours or not ours, and read like we read shells in shale, as evidence of a tide in thought, a moment when a species learned it could step gently into the dark and leave only light footprints? We notice how even our caution becomes part of the record, soft landings instead of crashes, long orbits instead of flags in every crater, and we wonder if restraint will fossilize as clearly as ambition, and yet, if silence can hold our tools without eating them, if dust can serve as a patient scribe, if vacuum can turn craft into scripture, then what might the wider cratered library be storing beneath these few pages of our handwriting, and what older, stranger signatures might lie a little deeper, waiting for us to learn how to read without breath? If the wider cratered library is storing more than our few pages, then each rim and basin feels like a shelf in low light, a half-remembered corridor where we walk with our hands out, not because we fear the dark, but because touch learns what vision forgets. We trace the curve of a rim softened by micro-impacts. Notice how newer craters cut clean into older scars, and in those cross-sections a timeline opens, simple and unhurried, layers of ejecta like thin blankets thrown and then settled, a quilt sewn by collisions and silence. What if every crater is a book with two authors, the impact that wrote it in an instant, and the long, patient editor of time who revised its edges into gentler grammar, so that to read the moon is to read both violence and forgiveness at once? We think of melt pools cooling to glass, of breccias gluing broken stones into a new hole, of tiny glass beads that caught the solar wind and kept it, and we feel how geology turns event into archive, how the brightest flash becomes the longest whisper. Could it be that buried beneath the mare's dark plains lie older chapters, still basins drowned in basalt like palimpsests, where gravity maps hint at hidden rims and mascons tug, spacecraft as if to say, "Remember me, I am here beneath the smoothness"? Maybe, maybe not. We follow the slopes down to floor-fractured craters where magmatic pressure once lifted the center like a breath held too long, and we imagine the crust as a listening drum, tense and thin in places, thicker and older on the far side where Maria are rare, and this asymmetry becomes a rumor we can't quite shake, a suggestion that heat and thickness and chance composed the moon's two voices, one familiar, one quiet. Is it possible that in those overlapping ejecta blankets there is a mirrored diary of Earth's worst days, impact silt, that also fell on oceans and forests here, pages we lost to rain and subduction, but which the moon kept, carefully, under a dust that does not rot? We think of isotope trails locked in melt rocks, of argon whispers that time the cooling, of titanium shades that separate one lava from another, and we see the way chemistry draws margins with steady hands when memory grows blurry, not because the moon intends, but because matter remembers by changing. And as we imagine drifting over the Terminator, where low sun makes every ridge speak in long syllables of shadow, we feel the pull of deep time soften our own breathing, and the craters become less like wounds and more like letters, an alphabet of circles and rays and floods, that the night reads aloud at a pace we can finally follow. What if somewhere beneath the smooth mare lies a fragment from an early epoch, a shard from the age when the surface was a cooling ocean of magma, a page that if lifted and turned would show us the first sentences of crust learning to be itself? And yet, if a library can hide books inside books, if basalt can be a bookmark laid across an older line, then what else might the hidden shelves be holding in their grey hush, and what new chapter might open when we learn to peel the layers without tearing the page? And if a new chapter might open when we learn to peel layers without tearing the page, then the coldest pages wait where light does not arrive, where the sun's angle never climbs, and the shadows keep their own weather, not because they are hostile, but because they are careful. We lower ourselves into a polar hush, where the crater walls hold back day for millions of years, and in that long night, frost gathers like a memory that refuses to evaporate, microscopic at first, then layered by time and chance, comet dust and solar hydrogen, making quiet agreements with regolith, until ice becomes a ledger written in pale strokes. What if these cold traps are books made of breath, exhalations from volcanoes, whispers from meteor tails, outgassing from rocks that once learned to hold water and then to let it go, pages bound by temperature alone, so that even a degree is a sentence, even a shadow is a seal? We imagine ice grains mingled with silt and glass, salted with isotopes that mark their journeys, deuterium telling of distant clouds, oxygen ratios hinting at origins, while the surface above remains hard and bright and dry, and we understand how memory can live under a face that shows nothing. Could it be that here, in darkness, climate has left a diary more faithful than the one on Earth's moving skin, beyond the reach of rain and river, and the hungry fold of subduction, beyond the editing fire of metamorphic heat, a diary that keeps the breath of ancient seasons, and the fingerprints of passing comets as clearly as a fossil, keeps the curve of a rib, maybe, maybe not, and yet we feel the patient accountancy of entropy working gently in reverse, not dispersing but collecting, letting vapor drift and settle, until the sun becomes a presence, a thin white thought that endures, because no wind comes to teach it to forget. We think of the moon's tilt small and steady, of shallow sunlight that skims the rims like a whisper, of temperatures that sink so low they seem outside of our language, and in that wordless cold the world stores what it cannot keep elsewhere: hydrogen seeded by the sun, oxygen locked in minerals, rare organics arriving like soft rumors, and then going quiet. Is it possible that some part of Earth's earliest weather is sleeping here by proxy, a ghost record of atmospheres that rose and fell while our oceans were young, their water cycling from mantle to cloud to river to trench, while the moon, unbreathing and unblinking, saved only the frost that strayed into its shade? We picture a rover's small wheel, etching a careful line across this dark instruments, tasting grains that have never known noon, and we wonder if reading ice is like reading a heartbeat caught over eons, a pulse slowed to a near still that still keeps true time, not because the moon watches, but because matter remembers by staying where it is left. And as our eyes adjust, the crater rim becomes a frame, and the floor a quiet stage, and in that stage we sense the presence of a larger cycle, water shifting between worlds, carbon taking long detours, nitrogen waiting for warmth that will never come here, and we ask whether silence can be a teacher of movement, whether the absence of change can contour our understanding of change elsewhere. What if this frigid archive, so small compared to a sea, holds the detail a sea can never keep, the way a single perfect shell tells us more than 1,000 broken ones, not because it is more important, but because it is intact. And yet, if ice can store the breath of comets and the murmurs of ancient vents, if darkness can keep the softest traces bright inside itself, then what might the echoes look like beneath the surface, where tremors travel and return with shapes of what lies hidden? And what might we hear if we place a listening instrument, not in light, but in this shadow, and wait for the ground to speak back in its own slow echo? If the ground could speak back in its own slow echo, we would lean closer to the hush and listen for the way a tremor finds its path, not because we expect language, but because patterns can be understood even when words do not exist. Seismology becomes a kind of touch at a distance, a palm laid flat against stone, and in that contact the moon reveals layers we cannot see, fractured crust that rings sharper than we imagined, pockets where ancient voids make the signal linger, a mantle that answers in a lower tone, and we realize that sound, even without air, travels as a careful messenger through the body of a world. What if moonquakes are the planet's faint memories resurfacing, not as images, but as timings, tidal strains from Earth's pull, thermal creaks after long lunar night, impacts elsewhere rattling the frame, and each arrival writes a line across our instruments like a signature returned from within, as if the structure itself was sketching its own portrait by responding. We follow these paths with patience, watching how echoes bend around density, how travel times stretch in thicker rock, how a reflection off a deep boundary can betray the shape of something hidden, and we begin to map without tearing, to reveal without digging, to read the interior the way a doctor reads the gentle thud of a heart through a stethoscope. Could it be that the moon's reputed hollowness, once a rumor, was only our inexperience with brittle crust and fractured blocks, a chorus of resonances mistaken for emptiness, when in truth the echo was the history of impacts and cooling, ringing less like a bell, more like 100 overlapping glasses settling after a quiet toast? Maybe, maybe not. Either way, the clues accumulate in their modesty. A crust thicker on the far side, a core that is smaller than Earth's and less molten, boundaries that suggest old magma oceans that slowly separated light minerals to float and dark ones to sink, a memory of sorting written in densities rather than in color. We think of Earth's interior by comparison, the restless convection that pushes plates to collide and subduct, the way mountain ranges rise and erode in geologic breaths, while the moon, lacking that vigorous churn, holds its earlier arrangements, allowing fractures to be archives, allowing faults to be bookmarks that the next quake reopens. Is it possible that entropy acts here as an archivist, letting energy fade in ways that preserve form, fractures that do not heal, voids that do not close, cooled conduits that remain as hollow signatures of long quiet magmas, so that time's eraser works more like a pencil, redefining edges without deleting the page? And when we align seismic hints with gravity maps and topography, an interior story becomes clearer, mascons weighing down basins like deep punctuation, Marinfill smoothing exclamations into steady lines, ancient impacts not only carving the surface, but adjusting the balance of the whole, shifting how future echoes will travel, how future quakes will resolve, not because the moon governs itself with intent, but because memory is physics and physics remembers by cause and consequence. We sense how even a shallow tremor can teach, its arrival from the limb arriving late, its path through the highlands arriving bright, and in those delays and brightnesses we hear crustal thickness, the way one hears the hollows and studs in a wall, and that hearing trains our perception to accept that absence is also form. What if this is how identity is kept on a world without weather, by internal whisper rather than external flow, by echoes and the long quiet between them, by slow flexing under tides we cannot feel but can measure, the way an old tree moves in wind even when its leaves are gone, and as our confidence grows we imagine lowering a new instrument into a tranquil crater, letting it nap through nights colder than language, waking it to record the gentle clicks of tiny impacts and the long sigh of dawn-heated rock relaxing, and in that collection of small events a pattern would emerge that could not be hurried, a map of patience drawn in repetition, not because we seek certainty, but because rhythm is soothing and truth often arrives as a rhythm. And yet if echoes can draft the unseen with such care, if the interior can be felt without being opened, then what more might be revealed when we stop asking only how the moon is built, and begin to ask how light itself writes on its surface, how the angle of illumination can carve a story from shadow as clearly as a quake can from stone. And if light can carve a story from shadow as clearly as a quake can from stone, then perhaps extinctions are read the same way, by the relief they leave behind, by the strange quiet that follows, not because silence speaks louder than life, but because absence sharpens contour. We look at the moon's unweathered face and see a ledger of impacts, ages layered without rain to smear them, and we sense that some of these strikes would have rattled Earth so hard that oceans forgot their boundaries and forests forgot their names, while here, in vacuum, the mark stayed crisp. What if each great basin is an echo of a day when our planet blinked, when ash became a sky, when sunlight grew thin and cool, when food webs unthreaded, not from malice, but from sequence, and the crater's ray strewn across this quiet body is the shadow of that sequence preserved. We imagine ejecta timing like punctuation, heavy strokes that can be dated by argon cooling and crater counts, then held against our own broken chapters, iridium-rich clays, shocked quartz in riverbeds, fossils stacked in steep decline, and we realize that geology is a duet sung across two worlds, one with weathered lyrics, one with a clear refrain. Could it be that Earth's archive often drowns its sharpest memories, subduction tucking ocean floors into heat, mountains eroding their testimony back to sand, while the moon, with no breath to blur the line, keeps a parallel transcript we can use to recover the rhythm, maybe, maybe not. Still, we hold the pieces together and listen. A great ring basin formed there, a layer of spherules fell here, ocean chemistry tipped, climate reeled, and a lineage ended so that another could begin, not because endings are required, but because time reshuffles the deck when energy arrives too fast. Is it possible that identity is broadened by these losses, that life's grammar expands each time an era closes, that what survives is not the strongest in a single way, but the most conversational with change? We trace how isotopes record the swing, carbon leaning toward a world dimmed by dust, oxygen in shells marking a sea that cooled and then warmed, sulfur hinting at fire that reached the air, and we compare these whispers with the clean scars in lunar basalt, the rays that stayed bright because no rain came to teach them to fade, and in this cross-reading we learn to soften our fear and widen our patience, to see that extinction is both disaster and rearrangement, a dropping of certain notes so harmonies can move in a new direction, not because suffering is noble, but because history is indifferent, and we are the ones who look for meaning. We stand at a chalk cliff where plankton became light, made solid, and at the rim of a lunar crater, where light becomes shape, and we ask whether memory prefers contrast, white on blue, shadow on grey, so that attention can find it in the dark. What if the moon's crater record is a guide to our own vulnerability, a map of near misses and direct blows that reminds us hazard is a rhythm, not a rumor, and preparation is a kind of listening? And yet, if impacts can teach without striking again, if silence can preserve the tempo of catastrophe, if a fossil bed on Earth and a ray system on the moon can rhyme across eons, then what might we learn by tracing the soft metronome beneath it all, the slow pull that raised tides and lengthened days, and quietly tuned the climate's breathing, while eras opened and closed like pages turning? And if we trace the soft metronome beneath it all, the pull that raised tides and lengthened days, then perhaps even a footprint can be heard, not because it speaks, but because dust learns the shape of pressure and keeps it. We picture that first step sinking into sharp grains that have never known rain, each angular particle locking against the next like 1,000 tiny gears, and suddenly a human weight becomes a fossil in waiting, not of bone but of intent, an imprint that will linger where wind cannot erase, and water cannot gossip, a diary written in grey. What if memory prefers edges this fine, where a boot rim casts a millimetre of shadow, and that shadow outlines a moment in a way no story can, and the regolith, born from eons of impacts and thermal cracking, acts like wet cement without the wet stiffened by vacuum and the slight cohesion of electrostatic charge, holding our brief hello the way ash holds the leaf it swallowed. We think of Earth where rain would have washed this mark by morning, where rivers gather scraps of days and carry them to the sea, where ocean floors slide into trenches and are remade into mountain light, and we realize why the moon feels like a temple of detail, because entropy here is slow and granular, because decay is a library rule rather than a fire, because micrometeorites edit rather than devour, softening edges by microns over centuries, while still honoring the sentence. Could it be that our identities, too, are held most clearly in the small compressions, the grooves worn smooth on a railing, the polish on a step, the way a doorframe shines where hands have learned their way, traces that on earth blur into the bustle, but in vacuum become scripture? Maybe, maybe not. We imagine the electrostatic lofting of dust at sunrise, grains lifting and falling, like a hush that inhales and exhales, and in that near breath, footprints settle deeper, rims softening just enough to become more themselves, as if time were learning how to hold them with care. Is it possible that the shape of a step can archive the physics of the moment, the mass, the angle, the pace, just as a fossil ripple in sandstone catches a precise wind from a vanished shore, and that future eyes could read our gait as clearly as we read the ripple's direction? Not because we are special, but because pressure and place conspire to remember without opinion. We follow this thought to the chemistry that dust keeps tiny glass beads from impact melt, shocked fragments that carry solar wind like bottled breath, a sparse alphabet of noble gases whispering how long surfaces have faced the sky, and in that whisper our passage becomes a footnote, a thin layer of disturbed grains that changes exposure clocks by a few moments, a punctuation mark made of curiosity, and then we look inward, to the quiet self that sometimes longs not to be seen at all, and we understand why such imprints feel both intimate and anonymous. The suit hides the face, the visor hides the eyes, and yet the pressure curve is unmistakable, the arc of lift and plant, the human rhythm folded into dust that has never known a heartbeat, not because we wished to leave a monument, but because moving is a kind of writing, and somewhere in that same plane, a tool rests with a fine powder tucked into its hinge, a grain lodged in a thread, a story nested in a small silence, and the thought comes that memory may be strongest where it does not compete. No birds, no leaves, no rain, only light, and the slow snow of particles too small to see. What if this is the true generosity of a place without weather, not harshness, but hospitality for traces, an invitation for the brief to become long, for the everyday to become an era, for a footprint to stand beside craters and not seem out of place? And yet if dust can remember a step and glass can remember a storm, if silence can hold our weight without judgment, then what might sunlight remember as it bakes this face day after day? What quiet chemistry might it stir in mineral skins? And how might color itself change so slowly that only a patient eye can see the story moving? If color can change so slowly that only a patient eye can see the story moving, then sunlight becomes a quiet chemist, not because it burns with rage, but because it visits every grain with the same measured touch. Again and again, we watch how the solar wind rides in with it, a fine mist of charged particles that do not roar but whisper, embedding in crystal skins, knocking atoms from edges, turning sharp to smoother, bright to muted, and in that slow alchemy, minerals learn a new face. What if each grain of regolith is a journal page, bleached and rewritten by the day, its iron freckles darkening toward glassy browns, its rims frosted by micrometeorite heat, its surfaces sputtered into nanophase iron that shifts the shade a breath toward charcoal, so that color itself becomes a clock for those who know how to read grays. We imagine tiny spherules born from sudden melt, cooling into beads that bottle traces of the sun like breath on winter glass, noble gases folded into their lattice, argon and helium, keeping time where clocks cannot tick, and we think of how, on Earth, rain would have rinsed this record into rivers, but here, in vacuum, the script survives, thin yet precise. Could it be that the moon's palette, those soft near-silver plains and pale highlands, owes as much to weathering by light as to the rocks themselves, that space weather paints with ions and microfire, not because stone asks to be colored, but because exposure is a kind of memory that accumulates? Maybe, maybe not. We feel how entropy works as a patient artist, taking contrast down a notch, blending edges that once shouted, until a calm emerges that is not emptiness, but agreement. And in this agreement, we begin to see subtler stories, ray systems that were once bright feathers, now drifting toward the background, glass that was once clear now seeded with tiny metallic whispers, an archive written in half tones. Is it possible that our perception too needs to weather, to sit in long light until definitions soften, and we can hold more at once, the geology and the time, the chemistry and the wonder, without feeling the need to choose? We think of fossils turned to stone by minerals carried in quiet waters, and we hear the echo here, in reverse. Minerals turned to story by a river of particles, by photons that arrive without sound and leave a difference behind. We picture a basalt plain waking from night to day like a slow inhale, surface charging enough to loft a veil of dust, a few centimeters, and let it settle again, and with each breath, color shifts by a fraction no eye can catch, yet the sum over eons becomes a tone we recognize even from Earth, a hush of gray that steadies the mind, not because the moon is dull, but because it teaches our attention to spread, and as we trace these changes to their measures, iron oxidized to tinier forms, glass devitrifying into silkier skins, the smallest meteors glazing surfaces with heat that cools before a heartbeat, we realize the lesson is not brightness but patience, not drama but duration, and that the day star from this distance is less ablaze than a sculptor whose chisel is time. What if the same light that fades a ray can also reveal a hidden line, when it comes at just the right angle, turning slight relief into language, shadow into meaning, and in that play of reveal and erase, we glimpse a kindness in decay, a way it makes room for quieter details to speak. And yet if sunlight can rewrite stone without a single word, if particles can place their signatures inside glass the way ink enters paper, then what might be said by the far side where the palette is different, where highlands hold their paler voice longer, and what might asymmetry itself be hinting at? A tale of heat and thickness, of cooling and chance, that asks us to travel into that hidden choir and listen for differences we have not yet learned to hear. If asymmetry is hinting at a tale of heat and thickness, of cooling and chance, then memory itself may have a shape we can touch. On Earth it wears away, on the moon it stacks. So we stand between two kinds of remembering and ask which one feels more like truth, not because one must win, but because the contrast clarifies. We see how Earth's memory is alive and restless, carved by rivers that carry silt like sentences downstream, folded by mountain belts where old seabeds rise to sunlight and shed their shells as chalk and dust, pulled under at trenches where basalt and clay return to warmth, and right again as magma, and in that cycle, identity rewrites itself with grace, a journal that accepts crossings out and new lines in the margins. What if forgetting here is not loss but the price of breath, the way decay frees nutrients for another forest, the way entropy loosens tight patterns so that new ones can grow, not because endings are kind, but because stasis is a quieter extinction. We place a fossil in our palm and feel its weight shift from creature to stone, calcium recast by groundwater into calcite that keeps the curve of a rib while losing the softness that once pulsed with life. And we recognize a mercy in this, form preserved, essence released, like memory simplifying itself to survive. Could it be that isotopes are the soul of deep time, invisible but steady, carbon stepping down its ladder in bone and peat and coal, oxygen counting pale temperatures in shells of plankton that fell like gentle snow, strontium tracing rivers through teeth and bedrock, so that a jaw can tell us where a body wandered, even after the name has returned to air? Maybe, maybe not. We follow atmospheric change like a tide that never stops, thickening with volcanic breath, thinning under rock that learns to bind carbon, brightened by oxygen from microbe-lit seas, dimmed by the shade of aerosols after great fires, and through these weathers life keeps adjusting its clock, stomata opening and closing in fossil leaves that still hold the logic of the air they tasted, corals writing daily bands that widen and tighten with lunar years that are not the same as ours. Is it possible that identity is the art of staying recognizable, while everything rearranges around and within, minerals swapping ions in metamorphic hush, continents drifting like sleepwalkers, trenches swallowing archives so that mountains can speak in a fresher tongue, and that our own forgetting is part of this art, a smoothing of edges so the present can fit? We listen to entropy's quiet patience, iron returning to softer oxides, glass relaxing toward microcrystals, organic matter surrendering to humus until it feeds another root, another ring, another shade of green, and we think of how the moon keeps its pages by lack, and earth keeps hers by change, and we wonder whether meaning prefers to be held or to be used, not because we wish to choose, but because comparison is a kind of kindness to confusion. And when we set these two modes side by side, the stacked and the erased, we begin to sense a third planetary memory that lives between them, sediments tucked into deep basins that resist subduction for an age, ice cores locking bubbles like tiny time capsules, zircons older than continents carrying uranium's slow sigh toward lead, all of them bridges over forgetting that allow a message to cross. What if our task is to learn how to listen at their pace, to accept that some answers arrive in half-lives and others in thaw, that perception itself must stretch like daylight, lengthened by the moon's slow drift, becoming wider, gentler, more willing to hold unfinished thoughts? And yet if remembering can be a river and a rock, if the world can both erase and engrave without contradiction, then what of the memories that are not ours at all, the ones we only suspect, lost architectures or signals folded into stone, faint geometries that might one day appear when dust is brushed aside and silence is asked a careful question? And if faint geometries might one day appear when dust is brushed aside and silence is asked a careful question, then perhaps the question is not only scientific, but personal. How do we recognize intention in a landscape that erases sharpness, not because it hides, but because entropy prefers soft edges? We imagine walking a lunar plain with patient eyes, looking for right angles where basalt loves arcs, for grids where ejecta splays like petals, for alloys that do not fit the local chemistry, and we let our gaze slow until it becomes listening to ratios and residues and shapes that resist chance. What if techno-fossils are less about machines and more about patterns, repeating distances, mirrored lines, materials layered in a way geology rarely chooses, titanium in a seam with copper, a smooth bore through breccia with no melt halo, a glass too pure for impact born in a heat that lasted longer than a flash? Could it be that a civilization leaves its truest trace in the quiet statistics of matter, nickel isotopes nudged from natural norms, rare earths paired like siblings that should not meet, a thin film of unusual polymers annealed into dust grains, that a sieve and a spectrometer might hear as clearly as we hear a voice? Maybe, maybe not. We remember how Earth eats its own evidence, oceans subducting crust and cities alike, weather gnawing monuments into stories, and we realize why our imaginations keep turning to the moon, where vacuum slows the eraser and the library stacks do not collapse each season, where even a footprint lives long enough to become a riddle. Is it possible that lost architectures could be nothing grand, no towers, no roads, but micro-archives, altered mineral skins, patterned pits from repeated landings, a faint halo of vapor-baked glass around a site that never sees sun, the smallest ring of melted regolith that does not match any known meteor's signature. We picture future hands, ours or not ours, mapping the far side with gravity fine as lace, noticing a field of tiny anomalies in a square that repeats, and we feel how identity quivers at that thought, how the self that loves certainty loosens and the self that loves wonder steps forward, not because we crave myth, but because we respect possibility. We think of isotope trails as the planet's lie detectors, how oxygen and titanium tie the moon to Earth like shared ancestry, how tungsten whispers of early separations, and we imagine applying that same listening to debris we cannot yet name, asking it, gently, where it has been, what kiln held it, what star wind polished its face, what if the absence of rust and rot turns time into a partner, allowing even modest artifacts to survive as long questions, and what if our method must mirror the place, slow, quiet, precise, no bulldozers, only brushes of light and numbers, only the humility to let silence set the pace. We run a gloved finger along a shard in thought and feel nothing, yet the idea moves, intent fossilizes as geometry, geometry fossilizes as probability, and probability becomes a kind of soft proof when piled high enough to lift a doubt. Maybe the record is already there, scattered and dim like stars before a constellation is traced, and all that is missing is the line we draw, the line we must be careful not to force, not because forcing is wrong, but because patience changes what we see, and as the imagined corridor of possibilities widens, we return to the ground, dust sharp as glass, grains charged at dawn, micro-impacts that nick every edge, remembering that even relics in vacuum weather into sameness, that entropy tends all galleries, even the silent ones, with a broom made of time, and yet, if meaning can survive as pattern, if memory can harden into ratios and angles, if the moon can keep what Earth lets go, then what else might wait, not on the surface but beneath the smoothness, buried under basalt like a sealed room, warmed once by magma, and now held in grey sleep? What slow, deliberate messages could be hidden in the plainest plains, inviting us to read a little deeper, a little slower, as if learning a language we used to know? And if slow, deliberate messages could be hidden in the plainest plains, then maybe they began long before us, in tidal pools that borrowed timing from a distant rock, not because the moon commanded life, but because rhythm is a kind of shelter. We picture early shores beating softly under a tighter pull, day lengths shorter, nights brief as a blink, and the sea breathing faster, stirring nutrients from depth to light, in a cadence that bodies learned to trust. And in that trust membranes formed, and shells formed, and habits formed that still whisper in coral bands and mangrove roots. What if evolution found its tempo by listening outward, by letting tides comb coastlines into classrooms where chance could repeat itself often enough to become chemistry, and chemistry could repeat itself often enough to become memory? We imagine microfossils falling as slow snow into basins, each shell a tiny clock with oxygen in its lattice, counting warmth and cold, counting the tilt and distance of a companion that moves away by centimeters, and we see how tectonics lifts and lowers these records. Ocean floors born at ridges, traveling like conveyor belts to trenches where they bow and disappear, subtitled with chalk and clay, carrying the diary of tides down into heat. Could it be that subduction is not erasure but a handoff, a long relay, where sediments surrender their water to mantle rocks, releasing a breath that feeds volcanoes, whose gases sweeten the air, whose ash feeds soils, whose warmth nudges climate, and the pattern echoes back into waves? Maybe, maybe not. We sense how identity of coastlines changes as the pull loosens, tidal ranges easing with distance, estuaries shifting, deltas learning new handwriting, sandbars migrating in wider arcs, and through it all, entropy does not break the story. It gently spreads energy, dulling extremes so that life can find the middle ground where patience grows. Is it possible that our own bodies, with salt that tastes like sea and cycles that answer to faint silver light, are still tuned to the old metronome, not as superstition but as inheritance, that the clock in us once matched a stronger tide, and the memory lingers as a comfort we cannot fully name? We linger with that idea and follow isotope trails like breadcrumb constellations, strontium in shells matching rivers now gone, carbon in sediments leaning toward cool centuries or warm ones, oxygen in coral hinting at monsoons that shifted with lunar nods, and we feel how layered time can be read, if we wait, how patience is not a virtue but a method, not because the world hides its meanings, but because they arrive at the pace of seasons and uplift and melt. And when we watch a tide creek fill and drain, mud cracking and then shining, fiddler crabs writing and erasing, we see geology's small rehearsal for larger acts, shorelines stepping landward, then seaward, ice advancing, then retiring, each motion a soft repetition that shapes until it remembers. What if the moon's slow drift outward is a teacher of gentleness, a way the planet learns to breathe more calmly, storms spread thinner, currents take longer paths, migrations lengthen and soften at the edges, and life responds by widening its windows, learning to flower under longer days and sleep under quieter pulls? We consider how atmospheric change rides on these rhythms, but also on its own, volcanic breaths, forest sighs, human plumes, mixing with tides that stir the ocean like a spoon, and we hear in that mixing the possibility that resilience is not stiffness but sway, maybe, maybe not. And as dusk paints a salt marsh with silver, we understand why ancient calendars watched both sun and moon, why fields were sown by phasing light, why boats left harbors on certain nights, not because magic ruled the water, but because attention did, and attention is how memory becomes useful. And yet, if life learned its first steps by listening to a pull across space, if coasts and creatures and clouds have all, in their ways, kept time with a neighbor's hand, then what other lessons live in the shadows that the moon casts, not on the tides we see but on the ways we see, on perception itself, on the edges that teach shape, on the quiet relief where darkness lets detail rise? If lessons live in the shadows the moon casts, on the ways we see, on the quiet relief where darkness lets detail rise, then perhaps vision itself is a tide that ebbs and returns, not because eyes are weak, but because contrast is a kindness. We stand at the line between night and day, the terminator, where sunlight skims low, and every ridge becomes a sentence, every rill a whisper, and the surface shows its story in long syllables of shade, like braille written for a distant gaze. What if perception is most honest when it is patient, when light arrives slantwise and does not try to own everything at once, when the high sun that flattens becomes a teacher of humility by failing to reveal, and the low sun that lengthens becomes a teacher of form by letting edges speak? We think of how dunes on earth teach us by dawn, how fossil ripples wake at sunset, how a cliff's bedding reads cleanly when the light grazes, and we feel a kinship with this lunar lesson that time and angle are tools, that to see depth we sometimes need to wait. Could it be that identity of places, of people, emerges strongest at thresholds, at the edges where one thing becomes another, where shadow meets shine, where a faint change in tone tells of buried lava or a collapsed tube or a wrinkle ridge, covered like a scar beneath powder? Maybe, maybe not. We let our eyes soften and follow a sinuous rill across dark basalt, a frozen river cut by lava that once flowed like night itself, roofs caving in here and there to reveal the hollow that remains, and we notice how illumination not only shows shape but hints at process. The smoothness that suggests pooling, the abrupt drop that suggests collapse, the fine line of ejecta where a small crater interrupts the story like a marginal note. Is it possible that silence improves our hearing, that on a world without wind the only motion is light and shadow, and the rare tremor, so that vision becomes the primary seismograph, reading micro-relief as if it were sound, reading brightness as if it were time? We think of rayed craters whose feathers glow at full moon and become ghosts at first quarter, and how the fading of rays under long exposure to sunlight is itself a clock, a gentle reminder that even stillness has weather when the weather is photons, and even absence has texture when the texture is angle. Not because the moon changes quickly, but because we learn slowly. We remember the way glaciers on Earth carve U-shaped valleys that speak best at sunrise, the way an ancient shoreline etched in bedrock appears when the sun is shy, and we translate that literacy to this quieter theatre, mare like ink, highlands like paper, mountains reading themselves across the page in light that behaves like careful hands. What if learning to see here teaches us to see at home? Sedimentary stories in soft light, fault scarps in raking sun, the subtle fold that only reveals when the day is low. And what if this practice, this discipline of waiting for the right angle, is a form of respect, a way of admitting that perception is a partnership rather than a conquest? We watch the Terminator glide each night, migrating across craters and plains, turning unknowns into knowns and then letting them slip back into luminous ambiguity. And we feel how knowledge itself could be like this, periodic, returning, never final, always improved by another pass. Could it be that the moon's steady phases trained more than calendars, that they trained attention to move with cycles, trained memory to accept recurrence, trained identity to be comfortable with partial views? Maybe, maybe not. Yet, as the rillers thin into shadow and wrinkle ridges lengthen into quiet waves, a thought gathers that seeing is not only about light, but about the interplay of light, and what resists it, and that resistance, shape, texture, history becomes visible only when we do not insist on noon. And so we wait and we watch and we listen with our eyes, until the landscape feels less like a picture and more like a pulse. And the pulse suggests a deeper map we cannot draw from the surface alone. And yet, if edges can teach us to see, and angles can teach us to listen, then what might gravity felt but unseen teach us to read beneath the pages, in the patterns that tug at passing craft and sketch hidden basins in the weight of a world? If gravity can teach us to read beneath the pages, then we begin by feeling rather than seeing, not because sight fails, but because weight tells truths that light cannot. A passing craft dips a fraction, a track bends where no ridge exists, and we realize the surface is only the cover of a book whose spine is written in densities and depth, in buried seas of basalt and frozen waves of crust that hold their shape without voice. What if mascons are punctuation marks from ancient violence, heavy syllables pressed into basins long ago, their weight pulling on orbits like a soft hand on a sleeve, tugging just enough to say, "Notice me, there is more here than smoothness." We imagine invisible mountains of denser rock poured into impact bowls, cooled into anchors that warp trajectories, a quiet choreography where mechanics remembers heat and shock by adjusting motion in the present, and the present in turn becomes a lens on the past. Could it be that gravity is the moon's deepest memory, a field shaped by every event and never fully erased, a palimpsest where basalt writes over an older line but not completely, leaving the sentence readable if we trace the pull with enough patience? Maybe, maybe not. We let maps gather like soft rain, topography meeting tilt, velocity meeting anomaly, and a pattern arises, far side thicker and older, near side thinner and flooded, as if asymmetry were not an accident, but a long conversation between cooling and impact, and the slow settling of a once molten heart. Is it possible to hear magma oceans in the way gravity leans, to feel a float of light minerals frozen into a crust that remembers buoyancy, to sense where the early mantle sank a little, and where it held? We picture the field like cloth under marbles, depressions around mass that do not show in photographs, yet rule the dance of dust and metal and intention, and by listening to small changes in speed, we begin to see the hidden basins drowned under mare, their rims intact below the dark, their stories heavy enough to pull on us from out of sight, not because they want to be found, but because causes keep their grip. And as we trace these tugs, Earth's own memory answers by comparison. Rings of density under old mountain belts, subducted slabs sinking cold and clear into the mantle like shadows with weight, river deltas sagging softly under their loads, showing how gravity is a biography wherever we look, even when time tries to smooth the text. What if the moon's mascons are a mirror for our vulnerabilities, reminders that what lies beneath can guide what moves above, that a thin shell rides on deeper arrangements, and the safest maps are the ones that include what cannot be seen? We think of entropy here, not as blur, but as settling. A gradual finding of low places where energy rests, a drift toward balance that writes relief into the field, and we understand why the simplest path for a spacecraft is rarely straight, why a careful pilot listens to silence as if it were a current. Maybe, maybe not. We set a fingertip on a globe and close our eyes, feeling the idea of weight as a language of cause, and we wonder which other stories speak this way. Ice sheets pressing continents down, and then releasing them to rebound, volcanoes emptying chambers, so that valleys rise a little, aquifers drained until land sags like a tired breath. Is it possible that identity, too, follows gravity's law in a gentler sense, gathering around centers we cannot name, pulled by histories that sit below awareness yet shape every choice? We let that thought rest and return to the moon, to the odd comfort of a field that does not lie, and we follow it to the smallest clues, minor humps and lows that taken together outline rivers of rock frozen in place, conduits and cumulates, intrusions that only gravity remembers clearly. And yet, if weight can reveal the drowned rims and buried flows, if the field carries the past as present guidance, then what other messages might reside in even smaller things? Tiny spheres of glass that hold the breath of storms, micro-archives scattered like seeds, waiting for a hand to roll them in the light, and hear the sun's weather whispered from inside. And if tiny spheres can hold the breath of storms, then we cradle one in thought and let it turn like a small moon in a soft palm, not because we expect thunder, but because glass remembers heat the way trees remember winter. This bead was born in a flash, impact melt flung into dark, cooling mid-flight into a perfect roundness that trapped whispers of the solar wind, noble gases tucked inside, like quiet guests who never left, argon counting the years, helium hinting at bombardments, a chemistry of patience sealed by speed. What if a handful of such beads is a weather archive of the sun itself, a diary where magnetic tempers and particle flares leave slight changes in ratio, slight signatures in lattice, so that deep time becomes legible, not in pages but in pearls of cooled light? We imagine a layer of spherules sifted through regolith, mixed by micrometeorite snow, sorted by gravity's fine sieve, and in that mixing the story does not vanish. It deepens, older beads sleeping lower, newer beads gleaming closer to the touch, a stratigraphy of sparks that never knew rain. Could it be that entropy, so often our soft eraser, becomes here, our gentle binder, letting grains settle into coherence, letting scattering become pattern, so that disorder gathers enough of itself to show a signal? Maybe, maybe not. We hold one to the mind's eye and see the sun breathe across epochs, quiet cycles and loud ones, its charged particles etching minute fatigue into crystal skins, its wind implanting ions that later tell their tale when coaxed by heat in a lab. And we think of fossils again, not of bone this time, but of weather, not of bodies, but of light. Is it possible that such beads born from catastrophe are better historians than calm rock? That brief fire preserves what long shade cannot, that a moment of violence makes a vessel that endures and therefore can be kind to memory. We remember Earth's archives and their hazards, oceans that fold their pages into trenches, mountains that shed words like snow, and we understand why the moon keeps turning up as our partner in research, its vacuum pausing decay, its silence allowing small things to remain audible, not because it loves us, but because it does not interfere, We picture a scoop lifting dust in slow motion, a sieve humming softly, grains clicking like dry rain, as beads separate by size, and we feel time settle into bowls we did not know we carried, turning numbers into a rhythm we can hum, implantation, retention, release. What if these micro-archives could calibrate our stories of early air and ocean back home, aligning the record of solar moods with layers of carbon and oxygen in deep-sea mud, so that two far libraries rhyme, the bead and the shell, the flare and the frost, each correcting the other's drift, and we see how identity widens in such pairings, how a planet and its moon share a single breath, measured two ways, how memory becomes more trustworthy when it is echoed. Maybe, maybe not. We think on the habit of glass to relax, to devitrify over ages into finer textures, and we ask whether even the most patient materials dream of changing, whether a bead's clarity clouds not as failure, but as another way of writing, another hand on the same page, and in that humility we turn to the broader plane, where beads lie among sharper shards, among agglutinates and metallic flecks, a constellation of small survivals that together spell weather, not in letters but in intervals, and we realize that reading them requires the same mood. The moon asks of every visitor, slowness, softness, a willingness to let silence take the lead, not because answers hide, but because they arrive like dew, and yet, if the sun's temper can be bottled in sand and kept for eons, if microfire can give us a map of storms we never saw, then what else might be stored in the moon's fixed gaze, the face that never turns away? What does that long synchronous look do to a world's sense of self, and how might a single, unblinking orientation shape the stories we tell when we look back? And if a single, unblinking orientation can shape the stories we tell, then synchronous turning becomes more than a mechanic. It becomes a mood, not because the moon chooses a face, but because gravity teaches it to keep one. And in that keeping, we grow familiar with a hemisphere, as if it were a neighbor's porch light. We learn the Maria by name like old streets. We map the highlands the way we map the wrinkles in our own hands, and the far side becomes a thought we visit in dreams, a companion who listens more than it speaks, whose voice we know by the pull of tides rather than by a change of expression. What if identity is a function of what we reveal and what we keep? A shoreline drawn between the seen and the unseen, the near face holding our myths while the far face holds our questions, the two together making a whole that no single glance can own. We think of how this lockstep dance lengthens our days and quiets our coasts, how tides settle into habits that cradle estuaries, how migrations answer to a rhythm older than maps, and we feel the comfort of repetition enter the bones like warm salt, not because it limits, but because it steadies. Could it be that our sense of time is braided with this steady face? Lunar months teaching crops when to lean, calendars stitching communities to a sky that returns, sleepers waking at a window of pale silver that arrives right on schedule, and in that schedule a tender continuity forms, near to ritual, near to song. Maybe, maybe not. We hold the thought that constancy can still carry change, that the familiar face we love has been slowly dimmed and repainted by light, its rays fading, its rims softened, its chemistry tasting the solar wind, so the same gaze is never quite the same, yet the pattern remains, and we too practice this paradox. Each day we grow without ceasing to be ourselves. Is it possible that the far side's hidden choir, thicker crust, fewer seas, older scars, reminds us that privacy is part of truth, that what is withheld can be as informative as what is offered, and that the symmetry we expect is a human wish rather than a planetary law? We imagine gravity's whisper maintaining this embrace, a compromise of spin and orbit that conserves energy and makes a single face into a shared language, and we notice how the arrangement trains attention. We become readers of small differences, of angles and shadows, of phases that carry nuance across the month like a story told in chapters, not because mystery must be solved, but because wonder prefers installments, We picture ancient watchers carving notches in bone at each returning crescent, sailors timing departures to a tide lifted with a familiar hand, shells laying bands as delicate as eyelashes with each lunar year, and we sense how memory diffuses through cultures and chorals alike, a soft archive in rhythms rather than in scripts. What if the unturned face also teaches humility, reminding us that any portrait is partial, that the far side of people and places may be thicker, older, quieter, shaped by other fires and other rests, and that respect, like gravity, is a gentle lock that keeps the dance kind. And as we watch the moon rise the same yet altered, low over water that answers with obedient silver, we let the notion expand that constancy is not a cage but a frame, not a wall but a window, within which change can be read without panic, in which time can feel safe. And yet if a steady gaze can hold so much motion, erosion by light, tides by inches, histories by habit, then what else might be held in our own steady patterns? What quiet influences might we be shaping without knowing? And if we looked again at the scars that cross the face we love, could they lead us toward the gravity beneath, the long drift outward, the future where the pull grows gentler and the nights a shade longer, asking us softly to imagine who we will be when the rhythm slows? If the rhythm might slow and the nights grow a shade longer, then cycles become our teachers, not because they promise, but because they repeat. We feel the moon's pull like a quiet hand on the ocean's shoulder, stoking tides that mix cold with warm, surface with depth, a stirring that shapes climate in ways that do not shout but endure, and we picture the long arithmetic of centimeters per year, stretching into altered currents, gentler tides, days unspooling a little more light, and life adapting its breath to a meter that changes while pretending not to. What if climate's great swings, ice stepping forward in luminous fields, forests migrating like green tides across latitudes, are scored in part by this nearby lantern, its gravity coaxing layers to turn over, oxygen to dissolve, carbon to settle, so that the deep remembers what the surface forgets, and the surface remembers what the deep cannot say aloud. We think of isotope trails as the margin notes of these conversations, oxygen in forums sketching sea temperatures like pencil lines on a pale page, carbon leaning one way in glacial hush, another way in meltwater clarity, strontium in shells, mapping vanished rivers that once braided into the sea, and we listen for how the moon's quiet metronome might have shifted those lines, nudging monsoons by a breath, altering the timing of blooms and the reach of reefs. Could it be that the ocean's slow pulse, measured in overturning years and tidal resonances, writes itself into limestone and chalk, each layer a softened echo of the mixing below, each fossil a syllable in a sentence about patience? Maybe, maybe not. We set our minds on a continental shelf where drowned dunes sleep under modern swells, and we watch sediment drift along shore, paused by headlands, released by storms, folded into deltas that curl like commas, and we hear in that punctuation a grammar of energy going from steep to gentle, sharp to round, a patient movement that entropy favors and life uses. Is it possible that identity thrives by leaning into these cadences, that creatures time their migrations to windows opened by the tide's clock, that mangroves stand with roots like calligraphy, in brackish margins, reading the moon as calmly as a book club reading a favorite chapter again? We think of forgotten epochs written in subtle ink, valves counting winters beneath ancient lakes, coral bands ticking off lunar months when there were more of them in a year, because the day was shorter and the moon sat closer, and the record whispers not urgency, but the clear surprise that time can change without losing itself, not because time is fragile, but because it is flexible, and in that flexibility, we find solace for our own seasons, our own atmospheric shifts that now carry our fingerprints, a plume of carbon that leans the lines, a heat that tilts the averages. We ask if it is possible to listen with both humility and care, to align new numbers with old ones, to let forums and ice cores and coastal peat speak beside instruments and satellites, so that memory becomes a braided river rather than a single channel, less prone to flood with certainty. Maybe, maybe not. We follow subduction's long loop, watching ocean floors walk toward trenches with their stories strapped down, organic rain pinned in clay, carbonate snow hardened into stone, only to be pressed into the mantle where water escapes upward to soften rock, to prime volcanoes to breathe out gases that will one day settle on leaves, dissolve in rain, and return to sea, the planet revising itself without stopping the sentence. What if this revision is a kindness, rough drafts becoming smoother, not because the world prefers simplicity, but because energy seeks balance, and in that seeking makes room for life to find the middle? We sit with that thought at dusk on a tidal flat, mud shining like a slow mirror, small waves lapping in phrases, fiddler crabs tracing ellipses that vanish under the next inch of water and reappear when it leaves, and we feel the familiar comfort of a return that is never perfectly the same. And yet, if the moon can tune oceans and open seasons, if isotopes can hum the key of forgotten air, and shells can count a day longer than any clock we own, then what else does this metronome touch beyond water? Does it lean into silence itself, into perception, into the way shadow guides attention toward the fine relief of what we might otherwise pass by? If shadow can guide attention toward the fine relief we might otherwise pass by, then silence becomes a medium, not because sound is forbidden here, but because in the absence of air, other senses step forward. Light takes on weight, texture speaks in gradients, and memory arranges itself in the pauses between brightness. We feel how quiet is not emptiness, but a field where small forces are finely audible, where the slow work of entropy can be seen as softness at the edge of a crater, as a film of nanophase iron dulling a once bright ray, as dust levitating at dawn like a breath that never quite becomes wind. What if silence has its own physics of attention, a way of helping us notice the half-life of color, the way a glass bead darkens by degrees, no clock would count, the way a footprint relaxes without losing itself, and in that noticing we experience time not as a line but as a temperature, a gentle slide from sharp to kind. We think of fossils on Earth whose quiet is crowded. Surf, birds, leaves, distant cities, each sound a veil, each veil a blessing and a blur, while here the veil is light alone, and so the faintest relief becomes a paragraph, the smallest collapse a chapter, the most delicate rill a sentence we can trace with our eyes, until understanding arrives like sleep. Could it be that silence is a teacher of scale, showing how climate can change without thunder, how atmospheres thicken and thin in whispers of isotopes, rather than in proclamations, how ocean floors vanish, not with a shout but with the steady bow of plates sliding into trenches, their stories kept in minerals that alter with grace under pressure? Maybe, maybe not, and still, we sense that in this still realm, decay reveals instead of erases, micro-impacts writing a soft grammar across glass, solar winds stitching invisible threads of charge that lift grains for a moment and set them back altered, time carving patience into stone until the surface reads like a lullaby. Is it possible that our own perception changes here, that in the quiet we become less interested in conclusions and more in continuities, content to ask what if as a form of love rather than of doubt, and to accept that memory, like regolith, is most honest when it is layered? We carry that lesson home to cliffs where fossil shells sleep in chalk without fanfare, to ice cores where bubbles hold forgotten air, to riverbanks where valves stack winters in whispers, and we begin to hear how the world's deepest archives avoid spectacle, how the useful truths are the ones that wait, not because drama is false, but because calm endures. We imagine silence as a wayfinder that points us toward hidden work, minerals exchanging ions in metamorphic hush, zircons counting through uranium's slow surrender, corals laying down lunar bands with the consistency of breath, and we understand that entropy is not merely decline but distribution, a widening of meaning across many small marks, so that no single loud announcement can mislead us? What if attention itself is a climate we can cultivate, a stillness that lets our inner weather settle until fine layers appear? And what if this practice, this listening without hurry, could keep us from losing histories that do not shout, from erasing identities that do not demand? Maybe, maybe not. And as we rest in that quiet, we notice how the mind begins to map by absence. A crater's center brighter than expected, a shadow too long for its ridge, a patch of ground that stays cool when nearby regolith warms, each difference a hint of composition, of grain size, of age, and we find that silence trains inference the way tide trains shorelines, gradually, accurately, kindly, not because silence is wise, but because it is spacious. And yet, if this space can hold so much light as weight, time as texture, memory as layers, then what might it reveal when entropy writes in grey more boldly, when edges soften into shared boundaries, when the world's drift toward evenness becomes the very script we learn to read? And how might that script teach us to see decay not as an ending but as a tender form of understanding that prepares us to turn the page? If decay could be a tender form of understanding that prepares us to turn the page, then entropy writes in grey like a patient hand, not because it wants to erase, but because it wants to blend the loud into the living. We watch sharp rims soften into low humps, glass devitrify into silkier skins, contrast sigh into subtle tones, and in that drift toward evenness, we begin to see how differences become relationships, how the isolated peak joins the plain, how the bright ray accepts its place as background, and in doing so, reveals what lies atop it. What if meaning grows as edges loosen, fossils moving from creature to calcite to chalk to cliff, ideas moving from certainty to context, rivers surrendering boulders to cobbles to sand until the whole delta speaks as one, so that forgetting is not failure, but the rearrangement that lets more voices be heard? We think of Earth's metamorphic hush, where minerals swap partners under pressure, garnet blooming in schist, as if heat had taught the rock a new grammar, isotopes shifting in slow ratios that tell how deep, how hot, how long, and we understand that change without drama is still a chorus, still a record, still a way of remembering by becoming. Could it be that identity strengthens when contrasts soften, the way dusk makes a city kinder, the way twilight on the moon reveals gentle wrinkles we never saw at noon, the way atmospheric change has, across forgotten epochs, leaned climates toward ice, and then toward green and back again, each turn not an absolute but a blending at the edges, where life adapted and learned to pass the lesson forward? Maybe, maybe not. We imagine entropy as a librarian shelving difference side by side, until proximity teaches kinship, volcanic ash settling on reefs that will one day rise as limestone mazes, desert dust crossing oceans to feed rainforests, seafloors descending into trenches to return as mountain light, cycles that look like loss up close and like continuity when we let time breathe. Is it possible that our perception matures by accepting the grey, by reading tone instead of only outline, by caring for gradients the way we care for names, so that a chalk cliff becomes not just white rock, but the soft press of a million summers of plankton, so that a lunar plain becomes not just dark basalt, but the quiet layering of impacts, space weather, and the slow fall towards sameness? We hold a piece of breccia in the mind, a mosaic born from a shattering, and notice how the fragments keep their edges while the matrix binds them, a compromise between memory and mixing that feels like a model for us, staying ourselves while learning to belong, not because we must dissolve, but because we can share. And when we listen to a coastline under a small tide, ripples and counter-ripples weaving a fabric that softens footprints without denying them, we hear entropy's lullaby, energy seeking lower ground, differences cooling into rest, patterns surviving as echoes rather than as proclamations, and we begin to trust the quiet work that makes landscapes legible to those who wait. What if the moon's widespread grey is not monotony, but invitation, a canvas where faint signatures are allowed to accumulate, ray ghosts, subtle halos, terraces barely there, so that attention grows precise, and precision grows gentle, and gentleness grows wise. We think of subduction again, archives carried downward, not to vanish, but to be returned in altered form, isotope trails stitched into new rock, water released to wake volcanoes that exhale clouds that seed rain that writes rivers, everything, ultimately, tending toward a shared middle where life can hold. Maybe, maybe not. We picture our own memories following the same drift, sharp recollections softening into themes, grudges dissolving into lessons, certainties becoming questions that hold more of the world, and we feel how this erosion does not empty us, but makes room, not because we forget, but because we forgive. And yet, if grey can teach coherence and blending can reveal pattern, if the universe's favorite direction is toward evenness, and that evenness is spacious enough for delicate truths, then what other signatures ride within the sameness, far side and near side, thicker and thinner, a hidden asymmetry that still refuses to disappear? What contrast remains after blending, and what might that difference be trying to say when we put our ear to the quiet and listen for the hidden choir? If a hidden choir still refuses to disappear, then asymmetry becomes our soft compass, not because equality failed, but because difference kept a light on. We turn our gaze to the far side where highlands rise like a pale hush, thick crust holding fewer seas, older scars set close like careful stitches, and we feel the weight of a world that cooled unevenly, perhaps with heat pulled beneath the near side, perhaps with chance favoring floods of basalt where our eyes can see, while the other face stayed quiet and tall. What if identity is the shape left by unequal cooling, the near side softened by mare that hid its oldest pages, the far side guarding a harder script, so that the moon's two voices are a duet between drowning and endurance, between smoothness that forgets and ruggedness that remembers, and we are asked to listen to both to hear the song. We think of oxygen and titanium drawing faint borders in rock, of thorium and heat-making elements pooled like embers under one hemisphere, of gravity maps that reveal buried rims under dark seas, and we begin to sense a history told in thickness, thick crust keeping magma from the surface, thin crust yielding to floods, a tilt of fate that became a map of light and shadow visible even to a child. Could it be that our own lives hold similar geologies, places where we are thin-skinned and reshape easily, places where we are thick and keep our first terrains, faults we hide under newer layers, ridges we let show, not because we choose but because early heat wrote the options, maybe, maybe not. And while we linger on that thought, Earth offers a mirror, continents and oceans unevenly strewn, mountain belts along some edges, basins at others, subduction tugging more in one arc than another, ice leaning into a pole until albedo turns climate into a self-reinforcing whisper, reminding us that balance often emerges from imbalance, that symmetry is a late bloom, not a seed. Is it possible that the far side's choir records impacts we lost to rain and trench, a dense cadence of older craters whose overlaps make a woven memory, while the near side's dark plains hold younger notes, wrinkle ridges and flow fronts and buried rims, that harmonize the old refrain with new rhythm? We trace this with patient eyes along the Terminator, where low light turns differences into relief. The highlands bright, rough texture scattering brightness like frost, the Maria's silk absorbing light into grey-blue calm, and between them boundaries that look like shores of time, strand lines where epochs met, not because the moon intends poetry, but because pattern feels like language when we are tired enough to hear. We think of fossils again, a chalk cliff beside a darker shale, two neighbors made from different weathers, one a rain of plankton snow, one a quiet settling of mud in deeper water, and we accept how adjacency explains more than any single layer can, how contrast is midwife to meaning. What if the far side's thickness was a shield that kept lava from washing the slate, a patient librarian saving books by simply refusing renovation, while the near side allowed many rewrites, so that truth survives in both, in what stayed and in what changed. Maybe, maybe not. And when we imagine walking there, no radio from Earth, stars crisp, highlands bright under an oblique sun, we sense how silence grows fuller where familiar signals cannot reach, how identity deepens when one learns to be whole without being seen, the way an old forest becomes itself when trails fall out of use. We follow isotope trails as if they were field notes left in minerals, argon clocking cool nights into rock, potassium stepping towards stability, oxygen leaning a little one way, then back, and we let these numbers soften into feeling a planet that split its memory into two kinds of keeping, one sheltered in thickness, one exposed to flood and light. Is it possible that asymmetry is not a flaw to be corrected, but a wisdom to be honored, the way a coastline's coves hold nurseries and its headlands hold storms, together making a shore that works? We rest with that, letting entropy play its grey music over both faces, rays fading, edges rounding, yet the deeper pattern holds like bone under skin. And yet if the hidden choir has taught us to read difference as dialogue, if far and near can share a single calm, then what else might we learn by looking for fossils where none should be? Imprints without bones, intentions turned to dust, signs that purpose itself can harden into trace even when life is absent, and that a world without seas can still preserve the shapes of passage. If a world without seas can still preserve the shapes of passage, then fossils need not be bones. Here they can be shadows that learn to stay, not because life pressed them, but because intention did. We picture a boot's tread holding its geometry the way a fern holds its frond in ash, a rover wheel tracing a spiral that loops back like a nautilus in dust, a fallen tool leaving a shallow negative where grains lock together in a hush of vacuum, and we feel how purpose can harden into trace when nothing comes to blur it. What if fossilization is simply the art of pressure meeting patience on Earth? A shell sinks and minerals repossess its rooms, turning muscle to lattice and breath to stone, while on the moon, a moment sinks into regolith, and minuscule charges glue the memory at the edges. Then the two archives, wet and dry, become mirrors of the same desire to keep shape. We think of agglutinates, those glassy clumps born from micro-impacts that melt and stitch grains into beads like black dew, each bead a residue of brief fire that cools into permanence, and we sense how even violence can produce a vessel for memory, how entropy can curate by collecting rather than by erasing. Could it be that a pattern of right angles repeated beyond chance is a fossil of design, that geometry itself can be dated by weathering into softer logic, that the absence of melting around a bore through breccia is as telling as a tooth in shale? Maybe, maybe not. We follow the idea through smaller scales to spherules trapping noble gases, to crystal lattices holding isotopes like timepieces, argon steps from heat to stillness, helium slips and is gone, unless taken in quickly, and we realize that a fossil of weather can live inside a bead, a fossil of footsteps can live in shallow relief, and between them, a layered diary emerges, light speaking through glass, weight speaking through dust. Is it possible that even our caution becomes a trace, that gentle landings fossilize restraint as surely as craters fossilize force, that the thin veil of disturbed grains around a site spells care in a language of centimeters? We imagine future readers our descendants or patient strangers, kneeling over a shallow trench above a paler ring where insulation settled below, a seam of altered grains compacted by years of soft shadow, a subtle signature like the growth ring of a slow tree that never saw rain, not because the place confesses but because physics does, and on Earth the echo continues, where river mud keeps the drag of a reed, where storm layers stack coarse above fine, where burrows fossilize a creature's decision as faithfully as any body, the echnology of intent, and we notice the kinship, trackways in sandstone, trackways in regolith, both saying here and this direction and this weight in a calm no witness can misremember. What if identity too is recorded in the paths we repeat? Desire wearing a faint corridor through days, choices compressing a habit until it holds shape even when we are not there. And if so, would the moon read us as a sequence of soft bends and careful stops, an etiquette fossilized in powder? Maybe, maybe not. We turn the object in our mind, a spade with dust in its hinge, a lens pitted by micro-fire, and consider how decay here is an archivist with gloves. No water, little chemistry, mostly light and small impacts nudging texture while leaving form, the opposite of Earth's appetite, where water remakes and soil digests. Is it possible that planetary memory chooses its medium by what it lacks? Earth keeps motion in stone because it lacks the stillness of vacuum. The moon keeps motion in dust because it lacks the rush of weather, and together they assemble a fuller record than either one could hold alone. We let that pairing soften into comfort, and in the quiet we think of subduction again, how our seabeds, thick with tracks of ancient currents and shells, dive into heat and vanish into new grammar, while the moon, unburdened, lets its surface remain a long sentence with few edits, a chapter where even the erasures are legible as gentle smoothing, not because it refuses change, but because it changes on the scale of kindness. And yet if a footprint can outlast an empire, and a bead can bottle a storm, if a grid of repeated angles might someday be read like a skeleton of intent, then what other fossils of purpose could be sleeping under basalt, sealed rooms of pattern, techno-fossil seams annealed by lava, archives held in grey silence, waiting for us to learn the patience to uncover without undoing, to read without insisting, to ask what else the ground remembers about the hands that once touched it, and the messages they left in the simplest shapes. If archives might be sleeping under basalt, sealed rooms of pattern, techno-fossil seams annealed by lava, then answers that look smooth could be covers, not because the planes are simple, but because time prefers a neat tablecloth over a complicated meal. We let our eyes adjust to the mare and see past the dark into the details that refuse to lie flat. Flow fronts stacked like gentle steps, wrinkle ridges curling like breath held too long, buried rims whose circles almost surface, like memories pressing against sleep. What if these seas that look like certainty from far away are in fact layered hesitations, pulses of lava that paused and advanced, cooled and cracked, then advanced again? Each sheet a thin decision made by pressure, by heat, by the slope's quiet arithmetic, until the plane we call smooth is really a stack of careful moments. We imagine how eruptions filled the old basins, not in a single flood but in many tongues, basalt spreading along low lines, ponding in sags, draining through vents that left rillers like signatures, and beneath, the older chapters persisted, caught between heavier paragraphs, their letters intact. If we can learn to read by gravity and by light, could it be that a mare's apparent calm is where process goes to whisper, contraction folding crust into ridges as it cools, trapped gas, leaving pits that look like dimples of thought, tiny quakes wrinkling plain speech into poetry, and that the conformity we see is not obedience, but the convergence of many small freedoms, choosing the same direction, maybe, maybe not. We watch rays cross the dark without quite dissolving, faint feathers laid by younger impacts that ignore older flow lines, and we see how stories overlay without cancelling, how a sentence from elsewhere can pass right through and still be itself, how meaning at the surface does not erase meaning below. Is it possible that our minds work the same way, new learning flowing over old, smoothing some edges, while leaving deep shapes intact, rewriting the ease of recall but not the bones of memory, so that when light hits at the right angle a buried rim returns? We follow thermal stress as night and day argue gently, tiny fractures tracing maps that repeat at scales, a self-similar tiredness that never breaks but keeps record, and in that quiet fatigue we hear the lullaby of entropy, not destruction, only distribution, energy retreating from sharp gradients toward balanced grays, where subtler lines can be heard. We think of fossils again, how chalk cliffs that look uniform are really made from countless lives, how a basalt plane made of cooled fire can also carry the imprints of shadows, the track of a wheel, the weight of a footprint, so that fire and stillness both become authors. What if the mere are not answers but invitations to slow down, to let the eye track a wrinkle ridge until it fades, then find it again farther on, to notice where a flow front breaks against an older obstacle now hidden, to trace a ghosted circle and feel the hidden crater beneath, like a heartbeat under a blanket? Maybe, maybe not. And beneath the plane, we picture rooms left by lava tubes, vaults where roofs held and then collapsed in beads, where voids took on the geometry of flow and froze it, a cathedral of absence that could shelter relics of passing time, meteoritic silt, the cool breath of old volatiles, perhaps even seams of altered dust that remember a heat different from impact's brief blaze. Is it possible that these caverns are pages we have not turned because we feared to wrinkle them, that the best reading uses instruments that do not touch, radar to sketch hollows, gravity to weigh absences, light to ask shadows for their measurements? We notice how color shifts at the smallest scale, iron turned to nanophase flecks that darken and smooth, space weather translating minerals into tone, and we accept that seeming sameness holds the very report we seek. How long the surface has faced the sun, how often particles have brushed it, how recently an impact refreshed it, like a wet cloth laid over an old table, not because the moon hides, but because it speaks softly, and in that softness we find a mirror for ourselves, remembering how resolve can look smooth while underneath decisions layer and settle, how an outward calm can be real without being simple, how identity can be a mare, dark from distance, richly textured up close, and yet if these planes that look like answers are really careful palimpsests, if each thin sheet of basalt stores a pause and a promise, then what might the next layer teach when we move toward the poles again? The paradox of water without rain, the glint of frost in eternal shade, and what else could those cold edges reveal about the memory of light that never arrives? If those cold edges could reveal the memory of light that never arrives, then ice becomes a kind of listening, not because it is alive, but because it keeps what light would take. We imagine a crater rim holding back the day for millions of years, shadow pooling like velvet, temperatures falling below words, and in that long night, molecules settle into a quiet treaty with dust, comet breath, volcanic whispers, solar hydrogen meeting oxygen in minerals, layer by careful layer, until frost becomes a ledger written in pale strokes. What if water here is a fossil of weather rather than weather itself, a record of passing tails and vents that never learned to rain, deuterium and oxygen ratios scribbling the margin notes of origin, each grain a footnote that points to clouds we'll never see? We picture a rover's lamp grazing the floor, a halo of silt glinting like a held breath, instruments tasting for volatiles in the upper centimeters, where time piles thin, and we understand how patience becomes a tool. The slower the light, the deeper the meaning, the gentler the hand, the truer the reed. Could it be that climate, which on earth roars through storms and whispers through rings in wood, writes here with silence alone, an accumulation without thaw that outlives empires and seasons, waiting for a question precise enough to deserve an answer? Maybe, maybe not. And while we linger with that stillness, we think of ocean subduction swallowing our archives back home, trenches drawing down the snow of shells and the ashes of forests, until they reappear as gases, rain and rock. The sentence revised beyond recognition, while on the moon the clause remains intact, fragile, yes, but also stubborn, guarded by cold and angle. Is it possible that identity survives best at the margins, where sunlight skims and shadows keep their counsel, where entropy collects instead of disperses, allowing dust to bury ice, and ice to bury stories until they are ripe for waking? We watch regolith creep by micro-impacts, a slow conveyor that both threatens and preserves, turning surfaces inward, folding clean frost under a veil, and we feel how loss and keeping can be the same motion, how forgetting is sometimes a careful wrapping. We think of isotope trails as the fingerprints of travel, deuterium leaning toward comet, oxygen hinting at interior breath, noble gases bright with the sun's long temper, and we wonder whether a thin core from a polar hollow could marry its timeline to Earth's, aligning frost pulses with glacial steps, linking a shadow's hoard to a river's retreat, so that two silences sing the same year. What if volatiles here are more than water, carbon, sulfur, the faint lace of organics that chemistry can coax from ultraviolet light, tiny letters in a text waiting to be sounded out, not as life, but as its alphabet, a patient inventory of what arrives and what remains. Maybe, maybe not. And beneath the floor we imagine harder cold, where heat from within barely whispers, where ice cements grains into a friable stone, where a small shock sends a crisp echo, mapping seams that cross like veins in a leaf, and we feel the pull of a method that is mostly listening, a cartography of tremor and glint instead of shovel and flame. Is it possible that our presence should learn from this terrain to move by reflection, to sample by breath, to leave only pauses where we stepped, so that the archive stays whole even after being read? We hold the thought of a single photon turned away by slope and geometry, and how that refusal becomes a sanctuary, a negative space that gathers positives across ages, and we see our own memory mirrored, the parts of us we keep safe by keeping them quiet, the stories that deepen when left unhandled, the griefs that become gentler fossils when shaded by time, not because secrecy is noble, but because care is slow. And yet, if a darkness can keep water bright, if a crater's tilt can become a vault, if an absence of noon can turn vapor into history, then what might the echoes beneath this frost be telling about the ground that holds them, about hidden hollows and subtle layers, about the way a world speaks through tremor when light cannot enter? And what else might we learn if we bring an ear, not a flame, and wait for the shadow to answer? If the shadow might answer when offered an ear instead of a flame, then light becomes our gentlest tool, not because it conquers, but because it reveals by degrees. We sweep dawn across a plain and watch relief rise from flatness, the low sun turning bumps into boundaries, wrinkle ridges into handwriting, ancient flow fronts into stacked sentences, and we learn that illumination is a kind of archaeology, a brush made of angles, uncovering without scraping, teaching us to wait for the right slant, so that the story steps forward on its own. What if every sunrise is a field school where patience is the first instrument, rakes of light tracing the edges of buried rims, the long fingers of shadow pointing to pit chains where a lava tube fell inward, the soft glow skimming a mare and showing a ghost circle of a crater that rests beneath the smooth dark, so that seeing becomes less about power and more about timing. We imagine crossing the Terminator slowly, counting seconds as rays advance like quiet tides, and we notice how even color shifts at low angles, nanophase iron darkening the old rays, fresh impacts gleaming with a paler truth, glassy spherules catching the day like dew on stone, each difference a clue not yelled but offered. Could it be that the eye, trained by this grazing light, learns to transfer the skill back home, finding fault scarps in evening shadow, reading fossil ripples at sunset, tracing the hesitant curve of an ancient shoreline that only appears when the sun whispers across it, and in that transfer, our calendars and cameras become softer, more faithful, less hurried? Maybe, maybe not. And under this delicate brush, time itself takes a contour, rayed craters fading as their bright ejector weathers under the sea of day, terraces emerging in the glare, then folding into dusk, agglutinates losing their shine in a slow surrender to uniform grey, a steady drift toward evenness that paradoxically increases the legibility of the faint. Is it possible that structure prefers to be read in penumbra, that shadow by thinning what is too bright, lets us hold more in mind? That mystery is not a deficit, but a contrast that permits knowledge to keep its shape. We think of how glaciers at Earth's edges learn to write with light, striations bold in morning and gone by noon, how a trilobite's moulded eye in limestone speaks clearly when the lamp is low, and we feel an old humility rise. The world is not hiding, We are arriving too fast. We pause and let the angle lower another fraction, and new details respond. Subtle domes where gas once lifted lava like a held breath, collapsed pits aligned like a dotted line across a buried conduit, a basin's inner ring whispering beneath the mare, its curve traceable only when shadow lies at a tender slant, and we sense that knowledge, like this light, works best when it grazes rather than pierces. Not because depth resists, but because depth is shy. We carry the method into the quieter sciences, isotope trails that reveal origins only when interpreted with care, oxygen ratios that mean little until they are compared across shells and seasons, carbon that tells a different tale in peat than in plankton, each data set a landscape that yields under thoughtful illumination and closes under glare. What if our questions are lamps and our patience is the angle, and answers depend less on brightness than on how gently we let them arrive? Maybe, maybe not. We picture orbiters planning passes to cast raking light at craters of interest, imaging sequences timed to the hour when scars are most articulate, a choreography of shadows that turns remote sensing into a kind of listening, and we mirror it with careful footsteps, knowing that one misplaced thrust of thruster or boot could flatten the very sentence we came to read. Is it possible that even memory in us needs raking light, revisited at different hours from kinder angles, so that what was once glare softens into form, so that loss becomes contour rather than blankness, so that identity can be felt as relief under fingers that are unafraid to move slowly? We let twilight deepen, watching the last silver lines contract like threads, and the plain returns to luminous quiet. But now we carry a map of its textures in our minds, proof that nothing was empty, only waiting. And yet if illumination can excavate without touch, if angles can recover buried voices and make them legible, then what might impact melt say when coaxed by heat in the lab, those rivers of glass frozen mid-sprint? What temperatures, what sources, what sudden histories could harden into sentences we can trace with a fingertip of fire, reading catastrophe with the same care we've learned to bring to light? If catastrophe can be read with the same care we bring to light, then impact melt becomes a transparent historian, not because it speaks, but because it cools at a speed that traps the truth mid-flight. We hold a shard in thought, its surface glossy as night water, its interior frozen in currents and swirls, and we sense how heat wrote briefly, then handed the pen to time, zircon forming at the edge of chaos, trace elements settling into patterns that will not rearrange, a snapshot of pressure and temperature kept like a pressed flower. What if chemistry here is a script we can learn, rare earth spreading like chords across a stave, chromium and nickel hinting at the intruder's origin, isotopes of argon setting the clock when the melt fell below escape, each ratio a careful stroke that points either outward to an impact or inward to a layer lifted from depth. We imagine a lab's soft glow, a grain mounted, a beam passing over it like a fingertip of fire, liberating noble gases that whisper the moment when heat stepped back, calibrating age against a calendar of crater counts and lunar nights, and suddenly an instant becomes a date that can be paired with spherules in distant soils, with thin clay laced in iridium on Earth's old shores. Could it be that disasters do the bookkeeping that calm forgets, fusing and resetting at once, erasing some slates while carving others, so that history stands out not in the quiet years but in the ones that shatter, and from those shards we read both source and consequence? Maybe, maybe not. We follow a melt river from a crater's rim toward its floor, its margins stepped like cooled lava on Earth, yet cleaner, more absolute. No water to upset the glass, only micro-impacts to stipple it with time, and we notice inclusions like islands, clasts of older crust sealed inside a newer flow, fossils without bone that still hold a lineage, a piece of highland bright caught in a darker sea, a memory nested in a memory. Is it possible to taste the mantle in these glasses, to hear the difference between feldspathic highlands and basaltic maria in the way light scatters through a thin slice, to learn where the heat reached and what it left untouched? so that a single fragment becomes a cross-section of depth without drilling. We think of Earth's analogues, tektites flung like black raindrops across continents, shocked quartz in riverbeds, spherules laid in layers after distant blasts, and we feel the duet again. Earth scattering, moon preserving, one telling the breadth of the event, the other keeping the interior record neat, not because one is better, but because together they complete a thought. We watch entropy work slowly on the glass, devitrification making satin from sheen, nanophase, iron dimming bright fractures into soft lines, and we realize that even here the drift toward grey is a blessing. It raises subtle contrasts, it lets inclusions show, it turns glare into legibility, the way grief can over years return a day to narrative rather than to sting. What if the path from melt to map is a careful braid? Field observation noting the ray lab heat teasing out argon ages, mass spectrometers weighing isotopes like careful hands, gravity surveys outlining hidden rings, and the braid only holds because each strand trusts the others to bring a different pace. Seconds for the shock, hours for the pour, millennia for the weathering, quiet for the reading, maybe, maybe not, and we picture the melt frozen at the crater's center, a glass lake now crazed with fractures, terraces slumping inward as the basin relaxes like a long exhale, and within that geometry, a code emerges, flow direction preserved in ripples, cooling rates captured in crystal size, temperature peaks archived in mineral pairs that only form together at certain heights of heat. Is it possible that even the smallest shard could align with a distant core of ice, both telling of the same year by different languages, one by fire arrested, one by frost amassed, so that catastrophe and quiet confirm each other like witnesses who kept different angles? We turn the fragment once more and see under a microscope's soft circle, a bubble arrested mid-rise, a tiny sphere that never reached the surface, and it feels like a breath held across eons, as if time itself inhaled and forgot to let go. Not because time stopped, but because matter remembered the pause. And yet, if rivers of glass can carry the temperatures of a moment, if ratios can recount the traveler's chemistry and the target's wound, then what else might these melts reveal when we trace their veins across the mare? Could they point to a deeper rhythm of impacts, a cadence that also shaped our own days, nudging tides and seasons until identity grew in step, preparing us quietly for the long drift outward that waits like a soft horizon? And if a deeper rhythm of impacts could have nudged our own days, preparing us for the long drift outward like a soft horizon, then endings feel less like stops and more like breaths held between tides, not because the story lacks conclusion, but because time prefers to pause. We rest with the idea that planets keep time in layered ways, lunar glass bottling a moment of fire, polar frost saving the quiet syllables of winter that never was, corals counting shorter days in pale rings, while continents slide toward trenches that read and rewrite. And in that layering, identity becomes a shoreline that learns to stay itself while changing its shape. What if memory is not a vault but a field where traces settle until we learn to walk gently, so that dust can hold our weight without complaint, so that isotopes can whisper origins without being forced into songs they do not know, so that a single zircon can carry 1 billion years without asking for praise? We imagine a map that does not end at borders, gravity lines curving under seas of basalt, wrinkle ridges looping like a patient script, spherules tucked in regolith like punctuation, each mark a kindness extended to the future, each kindness a bridge across forgetting, and we ask whether meaning is simply the sum of these bridges laid with care. Could it be that silence is our best collaborator, the vacuum that lets footprints linger, the still water under ice that keeps bubbles honest, the quiet in a lab where a beam releases argon from a crystal, and no one speaks because a clock is turning in their hands, and that this partnership, humble and precise, is how we keep from losing ourselves to noise? Maybe, maybe not, we follow entropy as it lowers the volume of contrast, turning bright feathers to soft ghosts, turning sharp rims to round thoughts, and we notice that as edges soften, relationships appear, the near and far sides conversing across thickness, oceans learning from tides, climates leaning into cycles we did not design yet have always answered. A choreography of patience in which our small additions now hum louder than we intended. Is it possible that care is a geologic force when it lasts? Restraint leaving fewer scars than haste, listening revealing more layers than digging, questions shaped like raking light instead of noon, so that the archives we touch can remain themselves after we have gone. We hold a bead of melt to the mind and a snow of plankton to the palm, and feel the two rhyme across emptiness, fire and frost agreeing on dates, catastrophe and calm finishing each other's sentences, and we wonder if this is the planet's oldest comfort, that opposites can share a ledger without cancelling, not because balance is guaranteed, but because continuity prefers companions, and when we look forward, we see the moon sliding away by centimetres, the day stretching by breaths, the tide's hand easing a little each century, and we understand that the metronome will change its tempo while keeping the tune, and that life, ours included, will learn again to sway. What if the future archaeologists of sky and stone are us, quieter and slower, arriving with ears more than with engines, reading mascons like paragraphs, lava tubes like rooms of thought, frost like a memory that smiles when woken kindly? Maybe, maybe not. We let the last light graze a crater's rim and watch the shadow pour back in, familiar and new, and in that returning dark we hear the thesis of the long night, that not everything must be illuminated to be known, that some truths are truer in penumbra, that patience is not delay but method. We think of subduction taking our best pages, and the moon keeping its own, and we learn to accept that a library can be shared across bodies, that a sentence can be finished on another world, and that reading together is stronger than reading alone. And yet, if this much can be carried by dust and glass and breathless cold, if tides can tutor forests and echoes can map interiors, if numbers can remember heat and silence can keep a promise, then what else might be gathered by the night that waits ahead? What tender instruments will we need? What questions will move like soft light across old relief? And when we arrive at the next quiet threshold, will we be brave enough to ask, gently, what if? And if we arrive at the next quiet threshold asking, gently, what if? Then crossing becomes less a step and more a soft recognition, not because the ground changes, but because attention does. We let our breath match the planet's slower clocks, the way days lengthen by tiny kindnesses, the way tides fold and unfold like careful blankets, the way rocks speak in isotopes that only answer when asked with patience, carbon leaning toward shadowed winters, oxygen leaning toward bright seas, strontium sketching old rivers across the enamel of forgotten mouths, and we begin to feel how memory is not a vault but a migration through matter. What if identity survives by traveling, bone to calcite, calcite to chalk, chalk to cliff, cliff to dust, and the message remains by changing its medium, while on the moon, messages persist by changing almost nothing, frozen in grey until a low sun translates relief into legible tone. We think of subduction as a school rather than a shredder, ocean floors surrendering water that loosens stone, volcanoes breathing out that water as sky again, ash raining the same elements onto soils that will hold forests, which will hold birds, which will carry seeds, and the page keeps writing while the binding dissolves. Could it be that loss is sometimes an engine, entropy, not as an ending, but as a distribution of meaning into places we did not expect? River mud, keeping a reed's drag, ice cores cupping, a small century of breath, impact glass bottling a day of heat, lunar frost, keeping a rumor of comets under the simplest geometry of shade. Maybe, maybe not. And still in this weave of changing and keeping, a tenderness appears, a way of listening that does not rush a confession, a willingness to ask the ground what it wants to tell before deciding what to take, a trust that some histories speak best in penumbra, glacial striations at dawn, fossil ripples at dusk, wrinkle ridges at the lunar terminator, where shadow carries more truth than noon. Is it possible that our perception of time is the tool that needs recalibration, that centuries are too short and evenings are too bright, that we are meant to read in thousands and in low light, the way a trilobite's eye learned to hold many small truths instead of one wide glare? We picture a bead of melt under a microscope, argon releasing like a quiet hourglass, and a coral slice beside it, lunar months ticking in pale silk, two clocks nodding from opposite rooms, and we feel the comfort of agreement without unison, like two voices singing the same song a measure apart, not because certainty is the goal but because harmony is. We let this understanding settle into the body, salt in blood that remembers oceans, trace elements in bone that remember stone, a circadian hush that answers the moon whether or not we notice, and a small relief that our habits can be tuned, less digging and more listening, less glare and more angle, less haste and more return. What if the next threshold is not far, not hidden, simply quieter than we are used to, a shelf of time where the archive waits in layered whispers, valves, dust, beads, frost, and the only key that fits is the one we carry when we slow down, maybe, maybe not, and as the imagined door eases open, we feel no triumph, only cordiality with the long night, its patience, its accuracy, its refusal to hurry a story that took eons to prepare, and we find ourselves asking smaller questions that open wider rooms. How does a single zircon hold 1 billion years without shattering? How does a footprint outlast a city without pride? How does a tide teach a forest to breathe without speaking? We think of future readers who will visit these same shelves, some of them us, a little older in our methods, some of them strangers who will treat our traces as politely as we hope to treat theirs, and we hope the pages we leave are light, legible and kind, not because legacy matters more than living, but because living is a way of writing for those who come quietly after. And yet, if the threshold invites us with such softness, if dust and ice and glass and chalk can carry time without complaint, then what else could our questions become when they learn to move like tides, returning, refining, growing finer with each pass? And what other rooms in this patient library might open next, if we promise to enter the way light does at dawn, sideways, careful and full of wonder? If other rooms might open when we promise to enter like dawn, sideways, careful, full of wonder, then perhaps the next door is carved not in rock but in repetition, not because the world is simple, but because cycles are generous. We let our thoughts follow the great turnings that thread through stone and water and air, the slow exhale of carbon from volcano to sky to leaf to limestone, the slower inhale that drags seafloors into trenches where heat persuades minerals to rewrite their vows, and we feel how identity persists by traveling through forms, how a message becomes durable when it learns more than one language. What if deep time is less a distance than a music, isotopes taking the melody, oxygen rising and falling with ancient seas, carbon leaning cool and then warm across forgotten epochs, strontium sketching migrations of rivers into the enamel of animals, whose names are wind now, and entropy, keeping the rhythm by smoothing sharp contrasts into phrases we can finally hear, maybe, maybe not, and in that hearing, patience settles into the chest like a tide that knows the moon will come, inches of water lifting salt flats into mirrors, then slipping away to reveal the hieroglyphs of crabs and reeds, each inscription brief and true, each briefly erased so the next can be true as well. The erasure not cruelty but permission for the page to continue. Could it be that loss is a teacher when it is slow, that decay is a kindness when it distributes rather than devours, turning cliffs to beaches where new shells will pile, turning forests to dark soil where new roots will learn the old stories? The way children inherit songs, we think of fossils as negotiations rather than captures, bone trading its frail calcium for steadier calcite, wood surrendering its cells one by one to quartz, each exchange a way to remain by becoming, the same logic that lets a basalt plain keep the whisper of a wheel, or a lunar bead hold the breath of a storm from the sun. Not because matter remembers like we do, but because change writes legibly when it repeats. And as the mind softens into this calm arithmetic, we glance toward the sky and feel the gentle geometry that keeps our hours. Moon slipping outward by centimeters, days lengthening by heartbeats, tides learning a quieter pull, tiny edits that will in ages alter the margins of coasts and the timing of blooms, subtle as a new line in a familiar poem, present as a different pause. Is it possible that perception can be tuned to these smaller scales, that attention, trained by shadow on a crater or dawn on a cliff, learns to love the almost and the soon, learns to trust the not yet without needing to rush it into now? Maybe, maybe not. We hold a zircon in imagination and a coral slice beside it, one counting in uranium's slow syllables, the other counting in lunar months, and we feel comfort in their agreement by difference. The way two witnesses standing apart can confirm an event more gently than one witness shouting. We picture subduction again, less as a swallowing than as a circulation of meaning. Oceanic stories carried down to be breathed back into cloud and rain. The planet revising without discarding, editing without spite, preparing new chapters by composting the old. Not because the world is wise, but because energy seeks balance, and balance leaves room. And with that room we notice how memory prefers edges. The boundary of ice and sea where brine channels freeze. Fossils of salt, the boundary of night and day where raking light turns flatness into a sentence. The boundary of silence and touch where a seismometer hears through stone. And we wonder if our own edges are where we are most legible. Thresholds of grief becoming tenderness, thresholds of ignorance becoming questions that fit the quiet. What if this is the method the library of Earth and Moon has been offering all along? Proceed by angle, return often, listen with instruments that do not shout, accept that some shelves are underwater and others are in shadow, and trust that a slow reader sees more. Maybe, maybe not. And yet if cycles can be doors and patience can be a key, if dust and chalk and glass can carry centuries without complaint, then which threshold waits nearest now? The one between pattern and intention, between natural symmetry and deliberate design. And are we ready to step through with the same soft caution, to ask in a voice made of tide and twilight, what if purpose too can fossilize? If purpose too can fossilize, then intent becomes a pattern we approach, like a shore at low tide, sideways, careful reading for right angles, where chance prefers arcs, for repetition where randomness usually wanders, not because we want to conjure ghosts, but because geometry can outlast breath. We let our eyes relax into the grey, and notice how the regolith keeps even the smallest insistence, a spacing that repeats beyond drift, a bore that passes clean through breccia without a melt halo, a seam of alloy that does not belong to local basalt or highland feldspar, and in those small refusals of nature's usual grammar, we hear a quiet suggestion that design might be a mineral, too. What if technofossils are less the bones of machines than the habits of making, layers pressed in unlikely sequence, a filament of copper sleeping inside glass, too pure for impact? A lattice annealed at temperatures that last longer than any flash could, and in that layered calm, isotopes lean slightly off the local script, nickel and chromium, speaking a dialect that rocks here do not learn. Maybe, maybe not. We think of Earth's ichnofossils, footprints, burrows, trails, evidence of behavior rather than of bodies, and we feel how a trackway in sandstone and a wheel line in lunar dust tell the same kind of truth. Here, a decision passed. Here, weight had a rhythm. Here, something returned along its own path. Could it be that intent is best read in recurrence? The way tidal rhythmites count the pull of a moon we never saw. The way coral bands tally months we did not live. The way a grid inscribed beneath basalt might announce not accident, but calendar, not scatter but purpose. We picture lava tubes fallen in a neat cadence, a dotted line tracing a once-roofed corridor, and wonder whether beneath one such vault a seam of altered grains waits. annealed by warmth not from impact but from habitation, a microclimate that persuaded volatile film to settle in a pattern no ejector ever made. Is it possible that restraint itself becomes a signature, soft landings leaving halos of disturbed dust, but no blast scars, instruments arranged in simple ratios that echo across decades, a geometry of care fossilized as thin rings in the topsoil of a world without weather, not because caution is moral, but because caution leaves fewer ambiguities. We follow isotope trails as if they were footnotes, argon clocks set by heat profiles that do not match sudden glass, deuterium hints that do not say comet, oxygen sums that tilt away from local rock toward something mixed, smelted, chosen, and we feel the patience of a method that treats numbers like dusk treats relief, revealing gently, refusing to shout. What if purpose can also erase itself by design? Materials chosen to return to sameness, polymers that embrittle into dust, structures folded into cavities that later collapse and read as mere pits, a practice of self-erasure that means kindness to a landscape while leaving only probabilities behind. Maybe, maybe not. We think of subduction carrying whole cities' worth of sand and steel into heat, until only elements return, a civic intention translated into gas and mineral, and we accept that even on Earth, our traces become chemistry, our stories becoming weather that nourishes things we will not see. Could it be that the moon offers the inverse, no plates to swallow, no rivers to scatter, so a whisper of pattern can persist, a faint tessellation sunk beneath mare like a pressed leaf under glass, waiting for gravity's ear or radar's soft question to bring it to the surface as contour rather than as confession? We hold both worlds in mind, one that keeps by forgetting and one that keeps by refusing to change, and recognize that identity prefers a duet, archive and erosion, artifact and angle, presence and the willingness to step lightly, not because permanence is possible, but because legibility is. And yet, if purpose can harden into ratios and alignments, if caution can fossilize as absence where violence would have shouted, then what else might our patience uncover when we sweep low light across the plain again? What new regularities will lift from the grey, and how softly must we ask so that a long sleeping pattern, if it's there, feels safe enough to answer? If new regularities might lift from the grey when we sweep low light again, then patience becomes our first instrument, not because slowness is virtuous, but because the world's finer patterns arrive only when hurried eyes grow tired and kind. We let illumination graze the plain like fingertips across braille, noting how a wrinkle ridge rises and then subsides, how pit chains align like ellipses practicing a sentence, how a ghost circle almost closes beneath basalt, and in those almosts we feel a language that prefers suggestion over claim, cadence over headline, the way tides teach without speaking by simply returning. What if recognition is an act of resonance, our inner rhythms finding time with outer ones, carbon isotopes leaning toward cool years while oxygen in shells leans toward warm, strontium in teeth recalling old riverbeds, as if place were a flavor, and on the moon, nanophase iron dimming rays while fresh ejector gleams, making contrast a calendar that asks only for a slower glance. Maybe, maybe not. We think of fossils as rehearsals of breath that learn to last, bone to calcite, leaf to carbon film, burrow to a tunnel of stone, and we see a cousin here in dust, where the weight of a step writes a pressure curve that outlives its maker, not because the moon preserves miracles, but because it lacks the appetites that undo them. Could it be that absence is the gentlest archivist, vacuum caring for detail the way deep cold keeps the script of air in an ice core, while Earth's busy kindness, rain, root, river, subduction, returns pages to circulation, making room for new chapters as old ones become soil for thought? We trace the slow logic of entropy, not as erasure but as widening, edges rounding, brightness, settling, extremes bleeding into middle tones where nuance thrives, and we recognize the same softness in coastlines where deltas unfurl into commas, in mountain belts where peaks weather, to sentences that can be read without gasping. Is it possible that attention itself has a geology, that perception fractures under glare and heals under raking light, that questions weather from certainties into shapes we can carry, that memory metamorphoses like shale to slate under the quiet pressure of years, until it holds together better, darker, truer? We imagine subduction not as loss but as translation, ocean crust carrying chalk and clay into depths where water unfastens minerals, rising again as volcano breath, an edit that returns characters under new names, and we place beside it the moon's refusal to edit, a page where even the erasures are legible as a softening of relief, not because one is better, but because together they keep us honest. We follow isotope trails like whispered directions, argon clocks set by cooling, hafnium stepping toward tungsten in zircons that remember magma oceans, oxygen in glass beads haunted by the sun's weather, and we let these numbers lull the mind into a rhythm where scale stops being a threat and becomes a lullaby, 1,000, million, billion, each only a longer breath. What if identity is the capacity to hold revision without breaking, coastlines learning to retreat with grace, forests migrating leaf by leaf, cultures loosening their grip on noon to see better at dusk? And what if science, at its gentlest, is the art of asking the same question with better light? Maybe, maybe not. We picture a radar pulse moving through regolith like a quiet knock, returning with the hint of a hollow where a tube still holds, gravity traces like silk revealing a buried rim, a seismometer feeling the smallest sigh after night. And we understand that listening is a technology, that instruments teach us manners. Do not shout, do not shove, lean in. Is it possible that purpose, if it sleeps here, sleeps under basalt as probability? Patterns too shy to name yet steady enough to invite a second pass, a third, as a shoreline invites footprints by remembering the last. We hold the thought lightly, like a bead of melt between tweezers of light, and we allow uncertainty to be a cradle rather than a cliff, a place where hypotheses can close their eyes and breathe until evidence arrives to wake them kindly, not because doubt is fashionable, but because truth dislikes being startled. And yet, if patience is our lamp and repetition our path, if entropy can be a teacher and silence an ally, then the next sweep of low light might show something we missed, a quieter alignment, a softer seam, a new way the grey arranges its thoughts. And what else could open if we let our questions slow to the pace of tides, returning and refining until the landscape, feeling our gentleness, decides to answer just a little more? If something might open when our questions slow to the pace of tides, then perhaps we begin by matching breath to orbits, not because the sky demands it, but because patience lets hidden rooms unlock. We sit with the moon the way we sit with a friend who prefers quiet, watching phases glide, tracking the soft recoil of days, lengthening by heartbeats, noticing how coastal air cools at low tide as mudflats shine like held notes. And we allow geology to become a lullaby, basalt settling, highlands brightening, rays fading from feathers to ghosts, until nuance takes the lead. What if memory is most faithful when it is shared between opposites, fire and frost, dust and rain, silence and echo, lunar glass bottling an hour of heat, while an ice core keeps a century of breath, chalk cliffs writing a million summers as a single pale wall, while regolith preserves a single step like a vow, and together these pages say more than either could alone. Maybe, maybe not. We think of isotope trails as soft lanterns guiding us through deep rooms, oxygen ratios in shells rising and falling with forgotten seas, carbon leaning toward glacial hush, or toward green abundance, argon clocks in melt glass setting the moment when catastrophe cooled, hafnium drifting toward tungsten in old zircons that remember magma oceans like childhood, each measure a gentle tap on the shoulder, saying here, this is where time turned. Could it be that entropy, our quiet editor, does not censor but composes, rounding edges so relationships appear, spreading contrast until maps align, letting a bright ray dim just enough to reveal the buried rim beneath, the way grief over years leaves the outline but returns the air. We watch subduction's long courtesy as seafloors bow and slide, bearing chalk and clay into heat, where water is returned to the sky, and carbon re-enters the conversation. Stories unbound and rebound, while the moon keeps its covers closed, holding chapters in place so a low sun can read them aloud. Is it possible that identity is simply endurance through change? Coastlines practicing retreat as a form of grace, forests migrating upslope leaf by leaf, cultures learning to see at dusk, where shadow turns flat ground into sentences we can read, not because we conquered noon, but because we learn to love angles. We imagine a radar pulse as a polite knock on a lava tube's door, gravity as a fingertip feeling for the hidden rim, a seismometer waiting for the smallest thermal sigh after night, and we notice how our best tools imitate manners. No shouting, only listening, no digging, only light, science evolving into a kind of hospitality where evidence feels safe enough to speak. What if even purpose, if it sleeps here, prefers to be found as probability, right angles that recur shyly, alloys with isotopes leaning off local norms, disturbed dust halos arranged in simple ratios instead of scatter, patterns that ask for a second pass, then a third, until confidence grows like a tide rather than a verdict. Maybe, maybe not. We hold two beads in imagination, one lunar glass with the sun's breath inside, one marine ooze rolled into a tiny carbonate sphere, and we feel the comfort of their complementary witness, one by fire arrested, one by water assembled, both honest, both small, both enduring longer than we planned, not because permanence is promised, but because patience is practiced, and as the Terminator slides, granting and withdrawing detail, we accept that knowledge will come this way too, revealed, then softened, then revealed again. Our task not to insist, but to return with steadier light, better questions, quieter hands, and yet, if tides can teach attention and dust can keep intention, if isotopes can hum the pitch of forgotten air, and echo can map a room we never enter, then what else might awaken, when we finally ask with the slowness of a shore, what other archives lie just beneath the obvious, waiting for us to lean closer and wonder, gently, what if this too remembers? If this too remembers, then remembrance might be less a photograph and more a tide that returns with different shells, not because the shore forgets, but because each wave chooses what to hold. We let that thought move slowly through stone and silence, through the pale patience of dust and the restless patience of water, and we begin to hear how archives hum in different keys, earth composing with circulation and change, the moon composing with stillness and shade, two approaches that together keep the melody from thinning. What if deep time is kindest when it offers multiple scripts for the same act, fossils in chalk teaching summers by abundance, tree rings teaching drought by narrowness, spherules teaching catastrophe by glass, frost teaching absence by presence, so that no single witness must carry the whole weight of truth. Maybe, maybe not. We follow isotopes the way one follows distant bells, faint but regular, oxygen in shells rising and falling with seas we never saw, carbon bending toward cold ages and easing toward greenhouse breath, argon releasing from impact melt like a sigh, kept too long, hafnium and tungsten, finishing an ancient sentence in zircons smaller than a grain of sand, and in their alignment, confidence grows like dawn, gradual, unmistakable, gentle on the eyes. Could it be that entropy, usually cast as loss, is the quiet author of legibility, rounding edges, so relationships form, letting bright rays fade until buried rims speak, letting glare calm into tone so smaller marks can come forward, the way grief softens into story and story makes room for listening. We think of subduction as the planet's bookbinder, Seams of chalk and clay carried down where water loosens vows, gases travel upward to sky, ash returns to fields, and the page re-enters the story under a new name. While the moon holds fast, a shelf that does not reorder, a ledger where even the erasures are readable as a thinning of contrast. Is it possible that identity is a practice rather than a possession, that coasts learn to be themselves by retreating with dignity? Forests carry their names up slope leaf by leaf. Cultures learn to see at raking light, trading glare for relief, so that nuance can be loved without fear. We picture instruments behaving like manners, radar as a polite knock that sketches a vaulted hollow without stepping inside. Gravity is a fingertip feeling for a drowned rim beneath basalt, a seismometer listening for thermal sighs at dawn. Each technique a form of respect that leaves the archive unbruised. What if intention, if it lies anywhere here, survives as probability, angles repeating beyond chance, alloys leaning off local isotopes, disturbed dust kept in measured rings? And what if our best response is not conclusion but return, a second pass in softer light, a third with a quieter heart, until patterns feel less like desire and more like presence? Maybe not. We hold a bead of lunar glass beside a curl of marine carbonate, one born in a breath of fire, one assembled by patient snow, and we sense how their smallness is their strength, modest, precise, easy to carry across civilizations. Truth scaled to hands that can be steady, even when ages are not because permanence is guaranteed, but because care can be taught. And as the Terminator slides again, confiding new syllables of shadow, we accept that knowledge will come on this schedule, revealed, softened, revealed again, the arc of understanding drawn not in a line but in a loop that invites us back without scolding. We think of atmospheric change written in quiet inks, bubbles in ice, that keep the taste of forgotten air, pollen in lake mud, counting forests that migrated without a map, dust in stalagmites, timing winds that moved with a neighbor's pull. And we ask whether perception can become more like these archives, less loud, more layered, less certain, more true. What if the gentlest science is an ethics as much as a method, not because soft is safer, but because soft is accurate when the subject is old and easily bruised, when the message is carried in grays and half-tones, in echoes and isotope hums, in traces that deny spectacle but invite devotion? Maybe not. And yet if earth and moon can share a library across vacuum and tide, if chalk and glass can agree on dates, if silence can hold a footprint as kindly as water holds a shell, then what else might we recover when we lean a little closer, breathing slower, asking smaller, about the parts of our own story that have thinned in the weather of years? And if this much can return by light alone, what might answer when we finally listen for the even fainter rooms, the places where memory dissolves into pattern and identity becomes an edge between two kinds of quiet? If identity becomes an edge between two kinds of quiet, then we approach that border as if walking a shoreline at night, not because danger waits there, but because meaning gathers where differences touch. We let the far hush of vacuum lean against the near hush of air, and feel how perception changes when two silences meet, sound falling inward on earth, while light thins outward on the moon, memory flowing through water here, while it settles as dust there, and in the overlap, time stops being a number and becomes a temperature, a gradient we can stand inside and learn to read with skin and patience. What if fossils are simply steadied gradients, life cooling into stone along a slope of minerals, footprints pressing into regolith along a slope of charge, impact glass quenching along a slope of heat, and the honesty of each record depends less on what it is than on how gently it crossed the threshold? Maybe not. We think of entropy as the craftsman of edges, rounding what is sharp until contact widens, ray and plane, ridge and shadow, cliff and surf. So relationships can form without breaking, the way a river braids when it slows, the way chalk cliffs soften into beaches that invite new shells to arrive, the way a ray fades just enough to let a buried rim introduce itself at dusk. Could it be that errors begin as edges, climate swinging across hinge points where ice meets ocean and albedo teaches feedback, where monsoons shift with the moon's nod and continents drift until trenches open like long commas, pulling pages down to be rewritten, while above, pollen and dust and bubbles keep enough of the phrasing that the plot can be followed? We follow isotope trails as if tracing a faint coast on a dim map, oxygen in forums leaning toward warmth, then back toward cold, carbon telling of forests that inhaled more and oceans that exhaled less, argon winding down to set the moment glass let go of heat, and each trail sharpens when set beside its neighbor, like two penumbras overlapping to make a line. Is it possible that the self is also an interface, not a fortress? Habits sedimented from many flows, choices compacting into thin beds that a careful question can core, grief annealed until it holds a shape that light can reveal, but wind cannot move, and that the kindest science we practice on the world can be practiced within, raking light instead of glare, return instead of rush. We imagine the Terminator sliding across a plain of mare, letters appearing in shadow, wrinkle ridges, writing in cursive, pit chains dotting soft lines, ghost craters tracing parentheses, and we carry that literacy back to a limestone wall, where faint bedding speaks at evening, to a snowfield where wind stripes turn into sentences, to a tree ring where a thin band recounts a dry year. Our voices cannot remember, not because worlds conspire to be read, but because we learn the language of angles. What if subduction is the planet's way of moving edges inward, stitching margins into interiors so heat can rephrase what cold stated? And what if vacuum is the moon's way of keeping margins on the surface, so we can return and see them again? The same scene in new light, our understanding a tide that comes back more precise. Maybe, maybe not. We listen to small quakes that follow sunrise as rock relaxes, to tiny pops of cooling glass that a sensor translates into time, to gravity's soft persuasion where mascons hold orbits like gentle hands, and we realize that edges are not lines but neighborhoods with their own weather, their own etiquette, their own clocks, slow enough for patience to be useful, long enough for care to matter. Is it possible that purpose, if any sleeps here, would choose an edge for its bed? A rim under shadow where frost can keep letters without ink, a lava tube's mouth where heat once paused and left a seam, a boundary of compositional change where alloys could rest as unlikely neighbors, and that our most honest approach is to wait for the angle that makes such neighbors visible without touch. We hold a bead of melt in one thought, and a pollen grain in another, two archives equal in modesty, both carrying a season's verdict farther than its weather, and we feel how edges become bridges when scaled to the small truth, crossing by capillaries instead of by roads, by sips instead of floods, not because the grand is untrue, but because the delicate is exact. And yet, if identity is an edge, and archives are edges and wonder is the quiet between them, then perhaps the next question rises by itself like tide on a calm night. Where else do thresholds carry the whole story beneath basalt, where void meets stone within ice, where brine meets crystal, inside us where memory meets forgetting, and what other shapes will lift from the grey when we choose again to learn their contours by moving slowly beside them? Where thresholds carry the whole story, beneath basalt, where void meets stone, within ice where brine meets crystal, inside us where memory meets forgetting, we lean close and listen for the way a boundary learns to speak, not because borders are dramatic, but because they are patient. A lava tube roof thickens and thins until a bead of collapse exclaims the hidden emptiness below. A brine channel in polar ice freezes salt into tiny ladders that turn cold into architecture. A brain tucks a scent beside a season, until one opens the other years later like dusk opening a shoreline. And in each case the edge remembers more than the center, as if contrast were its own kind of mind. What if geology keeps its best pages in margins, where mare meets highlands in a low scarp that writes tension into stone, where a wrinkle ridge pushes up like a quiet knuckle under cloth, where impact melt laps at older crust and cools with a seam that a microscope can read as temperature and time, and if so, could our questions become gentler by design, asked along the grain, not across it, with light that grazes rather than floods? Maybe, maybe not. We picture ocean subduction as a moving threshold, thousands of kilometers long, a hinge where seafloor carries chalk and clay into heat, releasing water that turns rock kinder, priming volcanoes to breathe, and this sliding sentence reappears as mountain light and rain, while on the moon the boundary freezes in place, a line we can revisit by angle alone, letting shadow sketch it again each month with reliable grace. Could it be that isotopes are boundary walkers, oxygen in shells, hugging the edge between warm and cold waters, carbon trading truth between air and leaf, argon stepping from melt to stillness at the exact moment a crater's fire gave up its breath, so that the world writes itself where states meet, and our instruments are only the pencils that trace those crossings? We think of forgotten epochs as long coastal shelves between histories, times when climate paused in a quiet soon, when forests waited at the foot of glaciers like travelers at a station, when dust settled over reefs without burying them, and it occurs that memory is richest when it has a little uncertainty to hold, like a cup that needs the air above the water to be useful, not because clarity is false, but because room makes truth gentler to carry. We kneel beside a polar hollow in thought, and see ice twined with regolith, a fabric of cold where sunlight never rehearses, and we imagine deuterium and oxygen ratios whispering origin stories, some grains leaning comet, others leaning volcanic breath, threads woven into a quilt that never saw rain, never heard thunder, yet maps storms that happened far away. Is it possible that identity behaves the same way, stitched from arrivals we did not plan, anchored by absences that turn to shelter, a lost song that becomes a ritual of quiet, a missing river that becomes a corridor of wind, a crater's shadow that becomes a vault where molecules learn to stay? We let entropy enter as the caretaker of edges, easing steepness into conversation, rays dimming until buried rims can lift their soft voices, glass devitrifying to show the shapes trapped within, cliff to talus to soil where new roots practice old names, and we understand that wear is not a thief when it moves slowly enough to introduce neighbors. What if purpose, if any lingers here, would hide at these same joins, an alloy seam nested where basalt meets feldspar, a pattern of right angles tucked under a lava lid, where a flow went thin, a ring of disturbed dust arranged by restraint not force, things that read like intention only when the light is kind and our certainty is quiet. Maybe, maybe not. We breathe with the Terminator's pace, and notice how knowledge arrives in the same rhythm, revealed at dawn, withheld at noon, rephrased at dusk, teaching us to revisit the same ground as if it were new, because in a way it is micro-impacts have added their commas, charge has combed the dust a different way, the angle has tuned a wrinkle into legibility. Could it be that the archive prefers our return to our discovery the way a coastline prefers 1,000 steps that come and go to a single storm that changes everything? We turn to our own edges and hear echoes of these manners, a grief that dissolves into patience so other feelings can speak, a certainty that rounds into curiosity so other facts can enter, a habit softened by time until a better one can set down roots. And it feels right that science and self should share a method, less shove, more listening, less glare, more raking light. And yet, if edges keep the book and margins carry the map, if thresholds are where truth chooses to become visible, then what waits under the next seam we have not touched? The thin line between shadowed frost and the rock that holds it, between glass that froze in flight and the clast it swallowed, between a question and the silence that sizes it. What waits there, and how gently can we arrive so that the answer, if it rises, rises like a tide that remembers where to go? If an answer could rise like a tide that remembers where to go, then perhaps our role is only to shape the shoreline with patience, not because certainty is shy, but because truth prefers to arrive in pieces. We lean into the quiet and picture a thin seam where frost touches rock, where molecules choose to stay because the angle denies noon, and we realize how a world writes with refusals: no air, no rain, no rush. And in that lack, archives flourish, lunar dust stacking its pages while Earth's seas turn theirs under, one keeping by stillness, one keeping by motion, together composing a single book of breath and stone. What if forgotten epochs sit just beneath the obvious, waiting in isotope trails that bend like reeds, the oxygen in shells that sway with vanished coasts, the carbon in peat leaning toward chill centuries, the argon in glass closing its clock, when heat let go, each a soft waypoint that lets us walk backward without stumbling, each a kindness left by time for those who move slowly enough to see it. Maybe, maybe not. We think of entropy as a curator who prefers grey frames, rays softened until buried rims can speak, glass turning satin so inclusions lift in relief, cliff to talus to soil where roots learn the old syllables, and in that long blending difference doesn't vanish. It becomes usable, like dusk turning glare into contour, so shapes stop shouting and begin to converse. Could it be that subduction is a form of memory donation, ocean floors surrendering chalk and clay into heat, so mountains and rains can be written later, while the moon keeps drafts pinned to the surface for rereading, low light, playing the part of a careful teacher who reads aloud and leaves pauses why, so thinking can grow. We follow the far whisper of impacts that set tempos we still keep, spherules in lunar dust bottling storms of the sun, tektites on Earth, teaching the reach of old collisions, corals counting shorter days when the moon sat closer and tides spoke louder, and we feel how identity stretches across these scales without breaking, not because it is rigid, but because it is woven. Fire to frost, dust to rain, silence to echo. Is it possible that purpose, if it ever brushed this ground, would survive as pattern rather than as monument? Right angles recurring beyond chance, alloys leaning off local isotopes, dust halos placed in ratios that read like restraint, a politeness fossilized as absence of harm, and the only way to hear it is to ask with instruments that behave like manners. Radar knocking, gravity feeling, seismometers listening for the small sigh after night. Maybe, maybe not. We hold two clocks in mind, hafnium turning toward tungsten inside a zircon older than continents, and a coral's pale rings keeping lunar months like quiet beads on a string, and we accept that agreement across difference is the tenderest proof, the kind that comforts rather than conquers, the kind that lets us sleep, not because doubt is banished, but because wonder has structure. We let the Terminator drift and watch a wrinkle ridge write its sentence, then fade, then write again next month, and we learn that knowledge is not a finish line but a cadence, a coming back with better eyes, a practice of raking light over the same ground until the ground feels safe enough to answer a little more. What if atmospheric change can be sensed in the smallest places, bubbles kept in ice like held breath, pollen stacked in lakebed pages, dust frozen into stalagmites that timed winds to a neighboring pull? And if so, could we learn to treat our present air with the same respect we give to the oldest, listening for its isotope hum, as if it were an elder speaking softly in a crowded room? Maybe, maybe not. And under all of it, a gentle arithmetic persists, days lengthening by heartbeats, the moon drifting outward by centimeters, tides easing their grip as centuries turn, a slow metronome that trained coasts, forests, and calendars, and that now asks us to tune ourselves to quieter measures, to read edges instead of centers, gradients instead of borders, patience instead of spectacle. And yet, if the tide of answers really knows where to go, if dust and glass and chalk and frost can all remember without noise, then what else might be waiting in the dark rooms we haven't opened? The silence under basalt, the hush inside polar seams, the shallow echo of a tube that never fell, And how gently must we arrive so that when it rises toward us, unafraid, like a coastline recognizing the moonlit line it has followed for ages.